E tau nei ki rungi a tātou katoa te wairo o ngā mātua tupuna, nā rākau i whakatakato te ara hei hiko nā mā tātou mauri i whakatoki o tātou ngākau ki ngā tikanga e aratuki a tātou ki a ngākau nui a tātou mahi katoa, pono e te ka me te arohanga o te hiki titi. E rongo whakakiri atu ki ngō tūturu whitipa, whakamau te tīna, hui e tāi. Nō re ngā moko mai nei te rimo o tō tātou koroai, koia kua tūmata kaua ki tātou e tēnei wā, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā no tātou katoa.
Summer's holding up the microphones actually, so if people want to speak from the floor, we'll throw these at you and you can catch them. They're catchable microphones apparently. So welcome back. So my name's David Gallo and I'll be emceeing again this morning. Welcome to you, Anna Rolleston, for one of our speakers this morning. Thanks for coming down. I look forward to hearing from you a bit later on this morning, so thank you. Just for our people in the hubs and on Zoom, hopefully we can bring them up, you guys up the back. If we could bring them up on the screen whenever you can and try and encourage our Zoom participants to turn their cameras on. I know that can be a bit embarrassing. I feel that myself when I'm on Zoom, subjecting the people on the other side of the camera to my face, but it's actually quite a nice thing to see people. There's a survey on the Slido that's that we'd like you to take a look at, and that relates to some advice that the sustainability team at Te Whatuora would like to receive from you around their work program. So if you've got the time during the course of the day to take a look at that survey and give them your advice, it would be really welcomed. A bit later on this morning, shortly, I expect, Minister Shaw will be here to make a short speech and to dish out some awards to some well-deserving people. Everyone is well-deserving, and each year there's an award ceremony, excuse me. And he'll be doing that this morning. There is a Q&A there, and it's going to be a bit of a, I'm not quite sure when he's going to arrive. It's supposed to be about 9 o'clock, so we've got a few minutes up our sleeve to fill in, and I think you can talk amongst yourselves for that period, I would have thought, rather than have me talk at you. So, but do think about the kinds of questions you'd like to ask Minister Shaw. You know, I've got a whole lot, but it would be really good for you to think about how we might be able to support him in his mahi and the questions that you want to ask him. So, until he arrives, is there anything else that you'd like us to talk through, Vicktoria?
Koto, is that working? Can you hear me? Cool. Just for those of you that are using Slido, so we're going to have the survey open, and if you go to the top of the page, you'll see there's two tabs. So one will be the poll that'll probably open when you open Slido, and the other one is Q&A. So just to make sure you can tab between those two, so you can have both open at the same time. We would really appreciate your feedback through that survey, so if you can make some time to do that through morning tea, that would be amazing. You guys are great. Another cool day, very exciting.
And how many went to the dinner last night? Could you? Oh, good. Here it was pretty good. Good, great, all right. Well, shall we just talk amongst ourselves? Are you happy to do that until Minister Shaw arrives? Okay, I think let's do that. All right, catch you soon. Kia ora everyone. It's a real pleasure to welcome Climate Change Minister James Shaw, co-leader of the Green Party, here this morning to address us and to have a kōrero with us and to answer questions that you might have for him. Welcome, James. James Shaw is a very positive guy. There's a lot talked about the cost of adaptation, mitigation to climate change, not enough conversation around the opportunity and the benefits of living better as we embrace the necessity to change. Minister Shaw gets that in its entirety, and it's a great pleasure to have him here with us today. He has spent a lot of his time and effort pushing for clean tech, post-carbon economy that works for all New Zealanders. And he understands the role that we play here in New Zealand as leading by example in many of the areas where we have invested solidly in the past. So I think that we're very much looking forward to him. He's got a great track record in Parliament. It's not been an easy road. I think we all know that. It was an extraordinary thing to get the Zero Carbon Act through Parliament with unanimous support in that first term, and congratulations on doing that. You know, it's a hard road, and I think that we're here to support you and to understand what we can do to actually help you make progress in the future. So with that, I'll just hand over to you, James.
Great. Thank you, David.
Very grateful to you.
O tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui kia koutou, good morning. I'm lovely to see you, and I also want to acknowledge there's quite a lot of people watching online, so hello television people, if you're one of those who are joining us virtually. Thank you for saving your carbon miles as opposed to flying to get here. First I just wanted to acknowledge that the sector is going through an enormous amount of change and has been under tremendous pressure over the course of the last few years. It's, I think, kind of a tall order to deal with a global pandemic at the scale that we have, and to restructure the entire sector simultaneously has obviously put a lot of strain, and the consequences of the pandemic as well in terms of immigration, global mobility and so on, the nature of how that's affected the health sector as well. So before I get into anything else about all the other stuff I want you to do as well, I just want to acknowledge all of that and just to thank you for your efforts. It has been a pretty remarkable time to be in government and to be a minister during a period of time where we did face this kind of one in a century health shock and the associated economic shock and so on with it as well. And when David said, it hasn't been an easy ride, reflecting on my job, I think I probably got it easy compared to people in the health sector over the course of the last few years. So thank you so much for all of your efforts and for looking after us and keeping us safe, and continuing to keep us safe as hopefully things kind of settle down into a slightly more normal state of affairs. There's a couple of things that I just wanted to kind of talk about, some of which I know some of you are directly involved with, others that may be more peripheral or you may have heard about it. In terms of the relationship between what we're trying to do to transform towards that zero carbon economy and the relationship with the health sector. And I will also touch a little bit on the intersection between climate and health more broadly. But I wanted to start with the Carbon Neutral Government Programme, of which health is a really, really big part. And the reason I wanted to start there, even though it won't necessarily directly impact on many of your lives, is because, as David mentioned, I think it is really important for us to lead by example. So, and when I say us, I mean the public sector as a whole, the government and the public sector. So back in 2020, in November 2020, we declared a climate change emergency, and alongside that we said that we wanted to, that the government, the public sector, would become carbon neutral from 2025 onwards. And that is a huge commitment. And in fact, I think if we'd known exactly what a huge commitment at the time, we might have picked a different date because it's, well, I'll get into the detail of why that's so complicated in a minute, but it is a really huge ask. And the reason that we said that is because we're literally asking everyone in the country to make this shift. So we thought it was only fair that we would go first and to show the way. And because the government spends, roughly $1 in $3 in the economy every year, and our ability, when we act in a coherent manner, to kind of shift things like supply chains to get kind of scale and actually to make things easier for everybody else in the country, just by going first, is a kind of really significant consideration. But also because, I think I'm a big believer in action learning, having been a somewhat hopeless academic myself. learned far more by doing things and then working out, what went well and what didn't go so well. Actually, when we start to apply this intention to be carbon neutral ourselves as a government and have to face all the incredibly difficult choices that then entails and have to struggle all the way through that in every different part of the public sector, with all the varieties of challenges that you have between, the health estate, the defence estate, education, conservation, all of the other government departments and so on. That really does help to inform our own policy making that we can then apply to the rest of the country as well, because we've had to go through it ourselves and we've had to work out just how to navigate through some of those challenges. I think that then builds an empathy for those in the private and non-government sectors who we're laying this challenge down to. But it also really helps us to develop, I think, much better policy because we've actually had to work out how to do it for ourselves. So we're kind of actually starting to make some great progress. I get a dashboard once a quarter which says how we're doing in terms of decarbonising the state sector, and the results are mixed. As you would anticipate, there are some agencies that started early and have, frankly, quite a light footprint, where their main, carbon emissions come from air travel and so on as they kind of, do their business. Some of them, it's a requirement. It's very difficult for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade to carry out its business without going and talking to people in other countries. But, that's the kind of challenge that they face. It's a bit more difficult when you take, for example, the police, who have got a couple of thousand vehicles that are reasonably high performance, and they're having to work out how to make that switch to electric vehicles over time that meet the same kind of standards that they have for an operational vehicle as well. And so, they're trying to struggle through that. Similarly, defence. There aren't a lot of electric versions of the things that defence uses right now, and so they have a particular challenge. And to be honest, as has been recently noted with the Prime Minister's trip to China, we actually don't spend a great deal on the defence estate, and so the equipment there is decades old, which also means that it's extremely inefficient. So even if they were to stick to fossil fuels, the current engines that they're using, whether that's on land or in the air or in the oceans, are decades old and incredibly inefficient and so on. So there are all of those kinds of challenges to work through. But health, you guys are the biggest of all. And that's because obviously we've got this enormous health estate around the country, with all of these hospitals and vehicles, thousands and thousands of vehicles, but also on-site generation. And as some of you will know, in many places around the country, a lot of that generation over the course of the last few decades has come from coal or from diesel, or from gas. But in that sequence, we're trying to work out how do we switch away from coal into other forms of generation, particularly for heat. And in some locations, that is a whole lot easier said than done. So I was down in Christchurch in the kind of the rebuild of the generation facility there, where they had an enormous multi-megawatt coal-fired plant. And are replacing it with wood chip. And someone would say, well, why are we kind of replacing one form of combustion with another form of combustion? And it's simply because the heating system across the entire rest of the hospital estate is wired into what is essentially a combustion heating system. And if you wanted to replace that with, heat pumps or, electricity or, something else, you wouldn't just have to rebuild where that coal-fired plant is. You'd have to rebuild the entire hospital, which we probably ought to do at some point anyway. But it was slightly outside the scope of what we're trying to do. So we've got these remarkable challenges to do. Things were a little slow with health compared to some of the other sectors and agencies that we're working through. But that's because you're dealing with the pandemic and restructuring your entire system all at the same time. So that's kind of understood. But you're now moving faster than anybody else. And that's fantastic. So we're getting some real momentum in the health sector now, which is great because it is one of the largest parts of the entire public service in terms of that footprint. And the lessons from that really are informing a lot of what else is going on in government. So for those of you who are directly engaged in that work, I want to say thank you. For those of you who aren't, but are curious, there's kind of information available online and through Te Whatu Ora and so on. So I would just encourage you to kind of take a look at that. And I think if you sort of shift from that, where we're getting to with the Carbon Neutral Government Program and the State Sector Decarbonisation Fund, where I think we recently committed to replacing, I think that we will have every single coal boiler in the entire public service, apart from one defence facility, will be off coal by 2025, 2026, which is fantastic given just how integrated coal was into our overall system. But you then start sort of applying that to everything else that's going on in climate change and health. And I think that there are some, that's where we start to see the opportunity. And as David said, I'm a great optimist, and I don't kind of mean that in the sort of naive hope that everything's just all going to work out. I'm an optimist because I have the privilege in my job of seeing where things are going right. I also see, obviously, all the really bad news, and there's heaps of it. Every single day there's a report that says things are worse than they were the day before, which was also a record-breaking day worse than the day before that. But I also get to see all of these things, how things are shifting, and the opportunities of the shift to achieve some better outcomes. So we were just talking before I came in about the new renal unit at Taranaki, which has been built to an extraordinarily high standard, and it's been built as a very, very low carbon building to a very high Green Star rating. And along with that come a whole lot of benefits, because if you want to build a really low carbon building, it means that you have to rely on things like natural light, natural air, fresh air, and natural sort of kind of heating and so on. So ambient heating and so on. And those things, coincidentally, when you design to a really high standard, also have quite useful health benefits. And they create quite a nice atmosphere for you to be in. And in a health facility, it's kind of good that you've got a healthy building. And it actually encourages people to recover more quickly. And it's a nice space for friends and whānau to be in when they're supporting their loved ones who are in the facility for medical reasons. And so I kind of apply that sort of thinking to everything that we're doing, because many of you will be involved directly in research around the intersection between climate and health, and you will know that a warming atmosphere leads to changes in weather patterns, changes in migration patterns for certain pests, certain disease vectors, and so on. And so generally, whilst the news is pretty grim for polar bears, it's also pretty bad for humans on a health basis as well. And yet the reverse is also true, that the solutions to climate change are also good for human health and create better outcomes, because we have more, we have healthier buildings that we're in, we have more livable cities, we lead healthier lifestyles because we're walking and cycling rather than taking vehicles everywhere all the time. Because we've literally designed for things where the parameters of having to live within the atmospheric kind of parameters, that itself helps to create a healthier world. And that, of course, means better health outcomes, and that means there's less drain on the public purse and more pressure on secondary and tertiary health because, well, there are just fewer sick people. So that, to me, is the kind of great opportunity of the transition that we're in, which is to say, well, we've kind of got to do these things because we've made a real hash of it, and things are going to get worse if we don't stop the crisis. But actually, if that crisis wasn't there, you probably do these things anyway. We probably ought to do these things anyway, just to create a better world, right, for all of us. And humans generally don't do that sort of thing without a crisis. So in many ways, having the climate crisis is a perfect excuse for us to do a whole lot of stuff that's just better for us collectively. And that, to me, is I guess the great opportunity that we've got in front of us when it comes to that intersection. I'm not going to get into the specific, horror stories around the different, what having, different mosquito patterns in Northland mean for human health. You guys are the experts in all of that. I guess the main thing that I wanted to say is that I appreciate the work that you're doing, and I think that there is an opportunity when it comes to the intersection between climate change and health that can help to actually to accelerate the work that you're doing regardless of where you are in the system. Whether you're a medical practitioner or an academic, researcher, or someone who's involved in administration and making the system work better. I think that there are opportunities literally everywhere through the system to say, well, okay, we know that climate change represents a tremendous risk to human health. It presents an enormous fiscal risk because of the increasing costs that come with those costs to human health. And as we kind of deal with the transitions that we're dealing with, what are some things that each of us can do wherever we are in the system that might help to flip that on its head and to say, well, I wonder if there's an opportunity here to turn at least some of this around. It's not going to happen quickly. It is a multi-generational, inter-decade challenge, but it is going to take all of us, and it is going to take everything that we've got. What I mean by that is, whilst it is really important that we have governments that provide the context and a good legislative environment and set up good incentive programs to help people shift, like the clean car discount and all of that kind of stuff, and support the public and private sector to transition through things like the state sector decarbonisation fund or all of that kind of jazz. There is that itself is insufficient. All we can really do is to create context. And within that context, all of the rest of us can get to do our bit and to play the role that we have to play as well. So thank you very much for having me this morning. I really appreciate the opportunity. It's not one that I often get, but thank you for all of the work that you're doing. And once again, acknowledgements to those people who are joining us from outside the lecture theatre virtually. Thanks very much.
Sure. So a few questions are coming through on Slido, and I'll just deliver them to you. They're coming from here, and they're coming from Otutahi, Otupoti, Tamaki Makaurau, and people on Zoom all over the place. So we have 3 hubs.
Great.
And people on Zoom. So yesterday, I think, how many people were online? 230? Yeah, a decent number anyway. Yeah.
Great.
There's one question here that's had quite a bit of support, and it relates to your thoughts on degrowth, which is kind of a political hot potato, isn't it? And its potential contribution to community health.
Yeah. Okay. So degrowth is I actually think degrowth is a concept. The idea that you essentially make a conscious effort to shrink the energy and material throughput in the economy rather than to grow it, which is what we historically have done. That to me is not a new concept. I mean, as a Green Party politician, that sort of notion of living within limits has been around for decades. The way that I see it is that we are going to get to a degrowth economy, and we can either do that in a planned way or in an unplanned way. Right? And the reason I say that is because ultimately, it is a finite planet, and the population is growing and will continue to do so for certainly the first half of this century, roughly, before it's projected to tail out a wee bit. And you simply cannot, it is simply a mathematical impossibility to continue to, increase the use of material throughput in the economy at an unlimited and exponential fashion. That simply becomes impossible. But you also can't get to there from here in a short period of time, because literally every system is built around the difference. So when I think about it, I think about what are the things that you do that start to lay down the pathway. So for example, when it comes to climate change, the first thing to do is to degrow or shrink your emissions, even while the economy is growing. And actually one of the good pieces of news is that New Zealand's emissions total flattened out in 2005. We emit roughly 80 million tonnes a year, which is what we were emitting in 2005, approximately. It's bounced up and down a wee bit, but it stayed flat. But in the meantime, the economy has grown enormously. So you've actually got, you've actually decoupled those things, which is great. Now what we need to do is to shift the emissions bit downwards in absolute terms, even while your kind of indicator of economic throughput will continue to increase. And I think that that's the kind of way that we kind of lay down that future. In terms of what it means for human health, well, degrowing or shrinking things like car use and relying more on active modes of transport is quite a good way of reducing emissions, having more livable cities and improving health outcomes. So I just think it's one of those areas where if we're conscious about it, like I was saying before, I think that we can create sort of multiple wins with these different interventions.
Cool. Thank you very much. Just going to use this red thing. It's good. Okay. Another one. Given we're likely to exceed the 1.5 degree limit, should we be ramping up our emission reduction adaptation activities at pace, and will the state sector decarbonisation fund be renewed?
So I'll start with will the state sector decarbonisation fund be renewed? There's kind of two answers to that, one of which is it's pretty obvious that we're not done yet, right? So whilst it's great that we're replacing all the coal boilers, we haven't really gotten going on all the diesel and gas and so on, and we've still got thousands and thousands of internal combustion engine vehicles and all of that we need to deal with, and the current state sector decarbonisation fund won't stretch to those things because it'll be tapped out in 2025, and that's okay. The second answer is, so whilst there's clearly a need, I can't say whether it will be renewed because that's ultimately a future budget cycle decision, and it'll probably depend in large part on revenues that are coming in from the ETS. And this has not been a good year for that, but next year might be a better year for that. So it's just, I just can't say because it's a sort of up to future governments and future budget cycles.
Do you have a position on that?
I do have a position on it, and absolutely, we need to continue to do that, and yes, we do need to pick up the pace. And actually, I mean, I've got some hope. It took a long time to get going, and again, part of that was because of the pandemic, but a lot of it was just we didn't have the capability, we didn't know what we were doing, and it took a long time to kind of build that. But now that that's happening, you can see the momentum really building. So things are moving a lot faster now than they were a year or two ago.
Okay. Another question that relates to, let me just get this right. It's about our fleet. And we are moving towards electric cars, obviously. But there's plenty of room, a lot of people are saying, for using bicycles and an e-bike fleet. Yes. And is there any progress or plan to introduce that?
Not across the sector from the centre, but because ultimately each agency has got quite different transport needs for their workforces, and so that's the kind of thing that we would push to agencies to say, well, you know what the parameters are. You kind of work that out, and for some agencies that'll make a lot of sense, and for some agencies it would make no sense at all.
So maybe Victoria, there's some in the survey that Victoria's asked you to fill in about advice for Te Whatu or a sustainability team. Maybe that could be a point, if you feel strongly, that could be something to raise.
There are certainly, the vast majority of public agencies, of course, have workforces that live close to a site of some description. And I know that some of our agencies are trying to work out how they deal with getting people to and from those and counting that, and also increasing use of home working as well.
There's a really heavily supported question from Sally, and she's asking about the issue of all taxpayers are paying an enormous amount to treat preventable disease. And what is being done to educate New Zealanders? She's referring specifically to eating a plant-based diet to address both climate change and health. But I think there are other interventions that, you know, the other co-benefits of moving fast for health. And so are we linking those together in our business cases or in our discussions, or are these things done in silos? How might we be able to improve that?
Well, there's a lot in that question, Sally. I think so. These things are definitely being done in silos. I mean, one of the I think, in fact, in many ways, the greatest challenge in my job is the fact that government is organised by these extremely tight kind of verticals, you know, for the different sectors. And the hardest part is trying to have some sort of horizontal overlay that tries to coordinate the action across different government agencies. We're getting there. We've got something called an Interdepartmental Executive Board, which is a function of the Public Sector Act 2020. So that's now the chief executives of the largest agencies have collective responsibility for implementing our National Adaptation Plan and our Emissions Reduction Plan. And that's starting to get some traction because they're starting to form a collective view about what the government's priorities should be rather than each agency kind of having its own. So that's starting to get some traction. How that applies to things like, you know, promoting healthy diets and you know, plant-based diets and so on, I would say is extremely early days and is likely to have pushback from other agencies that have got the interests of sectors that aren't so interested in plant-based diets in mind, which are important for our export markets. And so some of those things I think have a, you know, there's a kind of a tension of different objectives within government that we run into quite a lot, where different agencies are trying to achieve, frankly, contradictory outcomes. And that's not an easy one to overcome.
There are some sensational questions here, actually. We haven't got a huge amount of time.
Okay, I'll try and be brief.
But no, it's not you. It's our constraint. It's not you. Your answers are fabulous. But let's go to one from Alex, and it relates to public health. And what assistance could public health give you in unblocking action on agricultural emissions?
Well, that's an interesting one.
Maybe just something to clock.
Yeah.
Okay. And
yeah. Well, it's just. I mean, my kind of short answer to that is what is the relationship between health outcomes and agricultural emissions? And I mean, there is a thread, but I suspect there's a number of steps along that thread, which in public policy.
Direct and indirect.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Okay, there's one last question I want to ask you, and that's a big one, and it relates very much to the theme of this meeting, which is very much about mātauranga Māori knowledge and expertise in this area. And it runs like this, and it's well supported. Here we are. Climate change as a result of colonisation and Māori values or knowledge is critical in responding. Oh, it's just disappeared. Here we are. What is the government doing to not just decarbonise, but to decolonise?
Yeah. Well, decolonisation is, as a whole, probably above my pay grade in terms of the government's overall response to how we honour te tiriti and how we work with Māori and with Māori entities and iwi and hapu organisations. And I don't think that we've been terribly consistent across government in terms of how we've done that. How we're doing it in relation to climate change is we made a commitment in the Emissions Reduction Plan and the National Adaptation Plan that there should be a by Māori for Māori response and that we ought to resource that. And, you know, very early in that acknowledged that actually the Crown's not terribly good at that type of arrangement. We work with iwi Māori organisations a lot, but usually in a manner where we're dictating the terms. And so on this one we wanted to say, well actually that's not appropriate here. And so we're going through a process. The working title is to establish a Māori Climate Action Platform. It's a working title because we didn't want to name it either, and we didn't want to appoint the people to it. So what we're doing is we're essentially facilitating a group who are drawn from a whole variety of Māori, I'm going to say entities and organisations, because some of them are kind of iwi or hapu organisations. Some of them are things like Māori waste social enterprises and that kind of thing. So people with a lot of on-the-ground experience. And that group are due to report back in August, actually, with the design of what this overall response should look like. And I don't know, right, what that's going to look like. But what I understand where they're going is that they want to create a network that works with marae and iwi and hapu around the country, where the first port of call is to provide data so that people actually have got a good understanding of what the risks are that they're exposed to, because they are very different in different parts of the country. And then based on that, try to develop local mitigation, well, essentially iwi and hapu and marae level adaptation plans and mitigation plans, because they don't see a distinction between the two. They don't put them in buckets the way the government does. And to be very focused on kind of supporting action at that level. So rather than advising the government, the idea is that we would then kind of have the benefit of the insight into that experience, and that would help to inform our policy response. So it's not, the idea is that this network isn't supposed to face the government, it's supposed to face towards Māori, but it is supposed to inform the government through kind of real experience and sort of action learning. And it is very, very early days. We've resourced it to about $18 million in the last budget, in budget 22, and that resource will be unlocked once we've got the design and the things formally established. So it is exceedingly early, but I've actually got quite a lot of hope about how that is going to evolve over time, because I think it's one of the few times where I've seen the Crown kind of relinquish control and to say, okay, we will resource you to do this the way that you think it needs to be done.
I mean, just briefly, that was a pretty clear message that came through yesterday. Questions were asked, of some of our speakers, what can Pākehā do to help? And actually the answer was, give us the resources and let us do our thing.
Give us the resources and get out of the way would be a pretty good start. And we've seen it, actually, COVID, it took us a really long time, but once we actually empowered iwi and hapu locally, the vaccination rates went through the roof. But prior to that, we were getting nowhere. And I think that lesson was observed in much of the rest of the government system, and has helped to inform other approaches as well. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the questions, and thank you very much for the answers. There's quite a few more questions here. I don't know how you feel about us sending them on to you.
Yep.
Would that be okay?
Yeah, that's completely fine. Jo's here. She's my press sec, so she can
catch up
those
at some point and figure out.
Now,
you're aware now that we're moving to this sort of celebratory phase of the morning, where we're going to
first climate change, now celebration.
Yeah, celebration. Yeah, it's good. So we're going to recognise the work of people who've put a lot of their personal time and effort, expertise and knowledge into making considerable change for the benefit of all New Zealanders and for the climate. And there are 3 awards. There are 2 people who are here in person, and there's a 3rd person who's in our Christchurch hub who won't be able to receive the reward personally from you, so we'll just have to do a bit of a shout out, I think. But I think that we have these awards reasonably regularly at these forums. I think that just about everybody in this room probably deserves an award, to tell you the truth. And it's always hard to pick it. And I haven't had anything to do with the process, I have to say, although I do have to admit that I do know two of the people here pretty well who are going to receive awards, but I've had nothing to do with it. They've certainly gone above and beyond to advocate for positive environmental change and to improve the health of New Zealanders. There's a North Island award, there's a South Island award, and there's a sort of award just looking more globally or nationally, I suppose, rather than globally, nationally, I think is probably the term, isn't it? And the first award actually goes to a work colleague of mine from Middlemore Hospital, and many of you will know him, Rob Burrell. Where are you, Rob? You're here somewhere. Rob Burrell is an anaesthetist, and he's sort of been a campaigner to minimise volatile anaesthesia gas environmental pollution for a long time, really was quite instrumental locally initially by simply publishing the data and taking it to his colleagues, which was extraordinary. And that's largely, and with Rob's persuasion, it's about the message and the messenger. And Rob is very much a part of that anaesthetic whānau, and I think that they took on his message pretty clearly, and the drop in local utilisation of desflurane, I think it was, wasn't it, in particular, gone. Next battle, nitrous oxide, but that's not entirely within Rob's. Come down, Rob, please. You're supposed to come down. And Rob is, a sharp guy. He's witty, he's clever, he's sharp. And he's extremely nice. And and actually it's kind of like many people in this game, this is, one of the most optimistic things that you can do in our healthcare jobs, because it's often such a hard job, and and the workload is relentless, actually. We all know that, but actually to get involved with people like Rob is kind of fabulous, because you always come away with your cup filled rather than your cup emptied. So on behalf of everyone, I'm going to hand this to you, to hand to him, and then there's a photographer, and you can both look and look fabulous. Cool. Yes, you'd like to say an Oscar speech. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, it's not the Oscars, but I would like to say this is one for team anaesthesia. Okay, it's not for me. There's 1,000 anaesthetic specialists in the country. There are 300 trainees. There are countless anaesthetic technicians and anaesthetic nurses, and they've all been involved in this process of cleaning up our act. And they've done it with ambition, and they've done it in good spirits. They've done it in a way that's made them feel pretty good about doing the right thing. No patient has suffered. It hasn't cost us anything. We've just done better. And we should be really proud of that, and I'm proud to receive this on their behalf.
Great, thank you, Rob. We're going to go to the South Island now. Can we pull up the Christchurch hub, and if that's possible? And this award goes to an energy manager, Tim Empson. So are you there, Tim? I hope you're there. You may not be there, actually. I hope you are. Let's have a look, shall we? We love energy managers. Not all of us have had the experience of working with them. We had a wonderful one that really transformed our work program at Counties way back, actually. And now we've got a new one. Well, I'm not there anymore, but there's a new one. We had a little hiatus, but we know the value they add. Is Tim there? Oh, Tim, where are you? Wave. Hey, let's wave at Tim. I'm going to read something out now. So Tim has developed an ISO 5001 equivalent energy management system that covers around 50 clinical sites and represents over $10 million worth of energy. He gained the Certified Emission Measurement and Reduction Scheme certification for Canterbury District Health Board in 2017, which provided the necessary evidence base to justify his ambitious, or that ambitious, decarbonisation program that he has personally led and championed. This includes substituting coal boilers for biomass or ground source heat pumps, And under Tim's guidance, these technologies have saved millions of dollars and have created massive reductions in our healthcare's carbon footprint. He's championed the use of Green Star building measurements in new projects, leading to the first completed 5-star rated green building into Whataora's portfolio. He's an active member of the Transalpine Environmental Sustainability Governance Group and Sustainable Healthcare Aotearoa. He's well known nationally as a tenacious leader in greenhouse gas emission reduction for the country's health sector. He's pioneered projects which showcase current best practice for the transition to a low-carbon world. And his advice is sought by anybody and everybody who has an interest in the area. So, Tim, you're not here personally to accept this award, but no, on behalf of us, and I'll get the Minister to say a few words to you, thank you very much.
There you go.
There you go.
Virtual handshake.
Virtual handshake. And Tim,
from this end, Tim, congratulations. Thank you for all of the work that you're doing. That's quite a CV. David, as you read that out, I thought health might be lucky to keep you, given that experience, because the things that you've done there will be easily applied virtually everywhere else as well. But please keep up the good work. Thank you so much for all of your hard work.
Tim, would you like to say a few words if you can find a mic?
I'm not sure.
You don't have to, but if you'd like to, you'd be very welcome.
Thanks for that, James, and Dave. Thanks for being given this award. I really appreciate it. Just following on from Rob's comments, for me, it's team maintenance and engineering. I'm part of that team, and I don't work on these projects alone. The people that are keeping the lights and all the services on in the hospital are the people that help me on these projects. So I really do rely on those people. Thank you.
Congratulations, Tim.
Now, our final award is one where we've looked across at, big national contributions, and this award goes to none other than Vicktoria Blake, sitting right there in the front row, the interim head of sustainability at Whataora. So, please, Vicktoria, come up to us. Victoria's been a champion for this work for a very long time, initially out of the Bay of Plenty, working across sectors with the Council and Health, but has taken on quite a big role with Te Whataora and brought us together, and has thanks to the work of lots of people in this room, a substantial work program within Te Whataora now, which I think that we're all really proud to support. You've been tireless in your passion for this, Vicktoria, over a long period of time. You've recognised early on the benefits of working very closely with Māori, how much we have to learn and what we could do together, and what a kickstart we have compared to other nations, given the Indigenous knowledge that lies here in this country if we were only to tap into it, as we should. So on behalf of everyone, Vicktoria, thank you, and congratulations.
I will say a few words, but I actually just want to burst into tears because it takes every single person in this room to do what we're doing, and I'm really proud of us. We have made such great strides since we became Te Whataora. It is a genuine opportunity for us to make systemic change, and thank you so much to all of you online, all of you in the room, my colleagues who I put your beautiful faces up on the wall yesterday. We cannot do this alone. He waka ike noa. Kia ora.
Kia ora.
Well, I think that's the end of that session, and I'm going to return Minister Shaw's coat to him, and he's free to have a lovely day. Got a good day planned?
Thank you. Yes.
Good.
Yes. Actually, off to Kiri this afternoon for what I think is a very exciting announcement tomorrow. So watch the newspapers.
Great, and we'll have to grab that lapel thing off you. Should we
we'll do that.
Or?
Yeah, I'll do that outside.
Okay, cool.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Thanks.
Cheers. Thanks, David.
Cool. Wow, that's pretty fabulous, isn't it? It's very cool. Yeah, really nice. It's a lovely thing to celebrate our own We're going to move on now to our third major theme of this forum, which is related to protecting the Māori. And this theme is really about risk and resilience and how Māori can be shielded by ensuring that we are all well protected and by through achieving equity and climate justice, actually, for all of us. And we know how contentious that is, but at the same time, we know how important that is. Our first speaker this morning is Dr. Anna Rolleston, who's travelled down here to be with us, and we're very grateful to you, Anna, for coming. Anna Rolleston is the Managing Director of the Centre for Health. Her vision and lifelong mission is to create a healthcare system that works for you and with you. A system where you are fully informed of your choices and where you get to choose your own pathway to better health and well-being. No, the role of the healthcare professional is to do what the person in front of them wants done. Our role is to make sure they're as well informed as possible to make the right decision for themselves. They make that decision, we support them. So it's great mahi, and I think when you engage at that level of interaction with the people you serve, actually your joy in work is restored and regenerated and refreshed. We do need the time to do it. So that's another matter, but still. The philosophy at the Centre for Health is grounded in values that come from a Māori worldview. It acknowledges an all-of-person and culturally appropriate approach to health and well-being, regardless of your cultural context. Anna leads the development of that philosophy on behalf of the Centre for Health team. She's an absolute leader in this field. She is a recognised health practitioner and health researcher and holds various governance roles within the health sector. She's currently co-director of the Healthy Hearts for Aotearoa New Zealand Centre for Research Excellence, hosted from the University of Auckland. It's a collective of researchers, health professionals and community organisations that focus on improving heart health outcomes for Māori, Pacific people and importantly for women. Tēnā koe, Anna, welcome. The floor's yours. Thank you so much.
Ko ranginui kei raunga, ko papatuanuku kei raro, ko ngā tāngata kei wainganui, tihei mauri ora. Tēnā koutou katoa. Tēnā koe e te rangatira mō tō whakatau mō tō mihi I tēnei ata. Tēnā koutou e ngā mana whenua I tēnei rohe, tēnei whenua. Ngā mihi, ngā mihi, ngā mihi. Ko ai au. He uri o tauranga mōna, tauranga tangata hau, ko Ngāti Ranginui, ko Ngaitarangi, ko Ngāti Pukinga o ki iwi, ko Anna Rolleston, tōku ingoa. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Morena everyone. Thank you for the invitation to speak today. In the usual forum that I speak in, the first slide is usually a disclaimer slide. I don't have one of those today, but I do have a disclaimer that the vast majority of the kōrero today does not come from me, it comes through me. And that might give you a bit of an idea about the pathway of this kōrero today. The title says Bridging Science and Mātauranga, Reframing How We Understand Human Health. And I really want to acknowledge that I know that from a hauora Māori perspective, that lots of people are doing lots of amazing things to enact a Māori model of health, not just for Māori in this country, but a holistic well-being model for all people. Because a Māori model of health is actually just a human model of health with some cultural lens applied. So I do want, I am going to say some challenging things today, acknowledging that I know that people are doing lots of good stuff. I suppose the intent for today's conversation is to push the boundary out a little bit more. We've got to have disruptive change for our tamariki and mokopuna to flourish in the time to come where none of us in this room or online are going to be here on this whenua. Disruptive change is really uncomfortable. Disruptive change is significantly shifting what is currently happening. And so there's lots of gently things happening, which are all good things because all positive things lead to a positive outcome. But I was thinking that this might be a friendly forum to really push that boundary out and to challenge the edges of your comfort levels about what you're all currently doing that's amazing in this space. So as I said, most of what I'm going to talk about today is not mine. I did not create this knowledge. For those of you who have a really good understanding of mātauranga, you'll get what that means from that perspective, but even the science stuff that I'm covering off does not come from me directly. I potentially should have enacted a lesson that I learn every single time I come to a kōrero like this, is I should never prepare slides, because I am guided to kōrero. So I've got a bit of an idea and I've got some slides up here, but I might flick through them. I did a whole nother thing last night, and on the plane this morning I did a whole nother thing. So I trust that what I'm going to say today is the right thing, and whether or not it's on the slides or not, hei aha. Okay, so we all know this really well-known whakatauki, hea te mea nui o te ao, he tangata, he tangata, he tangata. What is the most important thing in the world? It is people. Okay, the challenge for today, the first pushing the boundary out, is that yeah, I love this whakatauki and I actually use it quite a lot. But is this really what we're after? Because I think what we're after is what this whole kōrero is about. Ka ora te whenua, ka ora te tangata. So if in hauora or health, and I define the two being hauora, meaning you're working holistically and understanding a model of health that is greater than medicine and science. So if you work in that space, then you work in hauora, or you work in health where you're in a system and somewhat constrained about your ability to deliver a different kind of model. But in hauora and in health, there aren't many spaces where the whenua is our patient. In fact, even in the work that we do in tauranga, I'm not satisfied at all about the extent to which papatuanuku is our first patient. So the dramatic and significant shift that probably needs to happen is that this is the mantra, this is the whakatauki. First and foremost, it is the health of this that is most important, and if we can sort that out, then we will, this thing that is connected innately to that thing will be well. Some of you people will know this beautiful lady. This is Whaia Donna Curridge. Donna is the chair of the Kahui Rongoa. I've got lots of really cool things to say about Donna, but she won't want me to say them. She is our leading rongoa expert in this country, politically and as a practitioner. And so some of what I'm saying today actually comes from Donna. So she says, from a healing perspective, rongoa Māori practices are never about a diagnosis, they're never about a disease. So this is that concept of hauora, is that we're not talking about a person with diabetes when we're thinking about a rongoa approach to hauora. Restoring the life energy, we, in Te Ao Māori, call it mauri, restoring the life energy of people and place. That's what's super important, people and place. One can't happen without the other. We can't fix what's inside if we are not paying attention to what is outside. So just bear those thoughts from Whaia Donna in mind as we progress this kōrero. We're not going to find the solution to our current issues out of the thinking that created them. This is a line from Rob McGowan, more commonly known in our rohe as Pāropata. He's one of our tohunga rongoa rākau, and I'm going to talk more about pā throughout this talk, but this, again, is a grounding philosophy for the way that we should be working. We say it over and over again that if we keep doing the same thing, we'll end up with the same result. Definition of stupid. I hear it in every conference, but we return to our workplaces and continue to mow the lawn. Okay, so it's a little bit about, yes, we're constrained in some situations, but if you believe this, then you've got to feel it and trust that you can make a difference and think differently, do differently, be different. These are the bits I might skip through quite quickly. So in medicine, this is just about how we collect what evidence is. So this is how we collect evidence in medicine, a randomised controlled trial, gold standard. Anything else not so good in terms of what we think the evidence is. And this is one worldview about the evidence to do something. And it's fine. I've got my foot in both worlds, an ability to see the benefit of this system. But being in a world doesn't mean that you should protect that system to the nth degree when you know it doesn't work. There are aspects of it that work, and there are aspects of it that absolutely do not work. Not even for health, let alone hauora, let alone the whenua. And unfortunately, in terms of health evidence, if that's our population here in Aotearoa, we're doing some kind of trial, so we take a sample of us to do something with, we give you a drug and you no drug, and we see what happens. And unfortunately, some of the issues with this evidence collection, this is just one issue, is that a lot of evidence in my space, in the cardiovascular space, there's not a heck of a lot of stuff about Māori people, there's not a heck of a lot of evidence that's built from women, and so most of the evidence assumes I'm a European man. So how does that make any sense whatsoever? So there are some sense checking that needs to happen just in our day-to-day understanding of knowing the truth about what is the right pathway to take to make a difference. And then we create normal or average. Don't know about you, but I'm certainly not normal. I'm not sure that I'd like to be described as average, but this is what we do in our system at the moment. Okay, which also means we're classifying the whenua in the same way. Papatūānuku's just normal and average. Actually, she's the be-all and end-all. Okay, this comes from Tā Mason jury. These are the rules of science and medicine. It's analytical, we all know this. It's sceptical, which isn't a bad thing. I'm not saying sceptical in a negative way, it's constantly saying, yeah, what about this? It's about measurement and replication, so you have to be able to measure it, and if you can measure it, it has to be able to be replicated so that we know it works over and over and over again. It highlights differences, this compared to that, Māori compared to non-Māori. Knowledge is constantly changing, it grows, and we call this centripetal thinking. We're drilling down into the smallest part, okay? And that's essentially how science and medicine works to collect evidence. However, any form of knowledge only makes sense within its own cultural context. And I would challenge that not many people have a cultural context in even their personal and whānau lives that reflects that description. Can I have the video up? So this video, if you're in health, you've probably seen this before. I've seen it 50 million times and I love it. This is Mason Jury talking at the launch of He Korowai Oranga a long, long time ago, but it really explains Māori health.
Continuing that same theme. The other event that happened in 50 years ago, 1964, occurred at the Palmerston Hospital when a young girl, a 14-year-old Maori girl, was admitted to hospital. Now she, for a week prior to her admission, she had had some behavioural changes. She was difficult at school. The school were concerned about her behaviour. She refused to go to school. 5 days before admission, she developed headaches, seemed confused. 3 days later, she was drowsy. She couldn't walk properly. 2 days after that, 2 days before admission, she began to have hallucinations. Her speech was garbled. And 1 day before admission, she had a seizure and was febrile, and then was admitted to the hospital. There was, 3 days before she was admitted, the general practitioner thought that she might have had a psychiatric disorder and was encouraging the family to commit her to Porirua Hospital. While she was in hospital, she had a visitor who was with her every day that she was in hospital. And that visitor was her koro, her grandfather. And he came in quietly. He was a shearing contractor, so he would get up early in the morning, organise his gang for the day, then come to the hospital to sit with his moko. He spent most of the time at her bedside. Every day he brought in flowers and some greenery. He just sat very quietly, and in those days it was unusual to have a visitor at your bed all the time. You had to come at visiting hours. And the sister on the ward, Sister Kernahan, was Irish, so she usually didn't tolerate anyone breaking the law, but this man was very unobtrusive and very quiet, and he was allowed to sit by her. He didn't make many requests, he just sat with her. There was a house surgeon at the ward looking after this girl, who was a Maori doctor. He had just graduated the year before, so this was his first medical job. He was very knowledgeable and very keen, but actually had no idea what to do. Now, when I mention that, you'll know that the house surgeon was me. And over time, the house surgeon and koro began to discuss the case and to talk about their views on it. And this was a conversation that happened between the two. After some time, the house surgeon said, "Koro, what do you think has caused the illness?" And koro replied, my moko was a victim of makutu. The house surgeon struggled a little. "What do you mean?" And koro explained that his daughter, who was the mother of the child, went to Australia with another man, and her husband's family took their revenge. And the house surgeon, remember, just graduated, said, "That sounds a little too hard to believe. An illness such as this does not develop because of an unseen curse or a mysterious force." So the caller said, "Well, doctor, what do you think caused the illness?" And the house surgeon said it was a virus. And caller said, "A virus? What did it look like?" The house surgeon said, "Well, I never actually saw it." "No, but did you touch it or smell it or taste it?" "No." "Doctor, I admire your faith in unseen things and your belief in the power of invisible forces." And the house surgeon was speechless. There was a third conversation with koro, and it said, "Doctor, is it okay to leave these flowers and these leaves here all night?" And the house surgeon said, "The nurse moves them to the corridor at night time." "But still close to the room?" "Yes. Why, is it important?" And the caller said, "Doctor, these leaves come from our place." They were kawakawa leaves, karumu leaves, and kōwhai leaves. And the house surgeon said, "Doctor, will they help her?" And koro replied, "Doctor, they are part of her." And once again, the house surgeon was speechless. And then there was a fourth conversation. A house surgeon said the girl did remarkably well, despite all odds. There was real concern whether she would actually survive, but she did, and made a good recovery. "Koro, your granddaughter's made a great recovery." Koro said, "I knew she would." I looked, "Did you?" "Yes, her mother called. They've fixed up things in the whānau, and the makutu has been lifted. But what about that virus thing, Doc? And the house surgeon said, well, that's been lifted too. And then there was a final conversation.
That whole kōrero is a really good watch if you haven't seen it before. But 5 lessons from koro out of that experience: the inseparability of mental and physical health, which we know as part of a holistic model that makes total and utter sense. The environment as a determinant of health. The importance of whānau and intergenerational concepts of health. Spirituality as a part of wellness, and different bodies of knowledge coming together and not particularly disagreeing with each other in this instance either. And of course, from these kōrero that Sue Mason had over the years, we got tapawhā out of this. So this is my segue into the next part of the talk. And really touching on the importance of the environment, the hauora of the environment, but also this spirituality, or this session is about mauri and about this idea of unseen. So if this was our description of science, this is Tā Mason's description of mātauranga. It's holistic. It has accepted truths passed down that don't require an explanation or an evidence trail. They always have a whakapapa, okay? But it doesn't need proof, like proof is defined in Western science. Based on environmental encounters, based on what happens in the environment, not what happens here, but what happens out there. It was a full moon last night, night before last, yeah? If anyone does not think that the impact of that thing on this thing is nothing, then, you know, this conversation is null for that type of person. Because if the moon can shift the entire volume of the ocean so regularly, and this thing is 70% water, how can we not be impacted when the ocean is? And so mātauranga is really about what is happening in the environment and what is the impact on me, on this thing that carries me around. Mātauranga highlights similarities. It's not a comparison. It's not about who's better than what, or Māori are less this than non-Māori. It's actually about what are the similarities that make a positive difference. And the knowledge is evolving. And so Tā Mason talks about centrifugal thinking, which is looking upwards. And you can take that as being looking at all of the different complex things that are causing this problem, or searching the heavens for enlightenment, or connecting to whatever is greater than you to solve problems. And so that is a slightly different way of seeing the world. And I'm going to skip through this because if you look in the literature, there's a whole lot of writing from Tā Mason about the interface space, where he says that it's possible for Western science and Indigenous paradigms to find common ground without compromising the foundations of either. This isn't a competition. We need both, especially with the crisis that we're facing. Right, this is a group of my Māori and Pacific colleagues for the Cardiac Society. So this is the Cardiac Society of Australia, New Zealand, Māori and Pacific Ropu, who met the other day. And so at the beginning, when I said I'm going to do some challenging things, these are my mates. I'm in there. Just checking I don't have the same clothes on. This generation, these of us, I'm going to include you guys in the room because I can see you. We sacrifice ourselves for this. So we don't get our bypass surgery when we need it. We don't choose we don't get the medical interventions that cost so much money, and we sacrifice ourselves for that and for our tamariki and mokopuna. because a lot of what we're talking about is going to be difficult to resource because so much of the money that is in health, the system, is focused on when we are acutely unwell. And there is very, very little at the front end. There is certainly very little money for spending on looking after the whenua in health. So if we agree with those statements I put up at the beginning, then we should be funding whenua-based projects, not tinana-based projects. Yeah? I know it's highly controversial. My dad got diagnosed with a AAA, abdominal aorta aneurysm. If they burst, you die. He didn't have health insurance. I made him pay for it. I made him go through the private system because I know so much about AAAs. So I'm not saying that this is a done deal from my perspective, because I still choose the pathway of acute care for my own family when it happens. But it's certainly a pushing the boundaries concept that we need to consider. How are we going to fund this? The money's got to come from somewhere. We're not like some ginormous country with billions and billions and trillions of dollars. We have 5 million people there. We are a small economy. How are we going to fund what we're all talking about? Introducing Pāropata and Tiwai Waka. So Tiwai Waka is a collective of people committed to healing the mauri of the whenua, healing the mauri of the whenua. Okay, so this is a concept about what you cannot see and which you will not find in evidence collection, science, medicine. Care for the earth so that she can care for us. These are Pa's words. And this is what he said to me about 5 years ago, which significantly challenged me and disrupted the entire... I thought we did amazing... Well, I still think we do amazing things in our little rohe. But he said, what you do at the Centre for Health for people is great. But if you don't care for the whenua, how can people be well? He was like, you do all these great things, you do this different model of care, but what are you doing over here? And how can you be looking after people if none of your resources going into Papatūānuku? And so 5 years ago, some of our philosophy changed, and I'm not saying that we do it well now. I recommend you go and have a look at the Tiwai Waka website. It's just tiwaiwaka.nz. But essentially, Tiwai Waka is a series of principles that came to Pa in the middle of the night. I'm not going to do the whakapapa of Tiwai Waka. Some of it is on the website, but actually that's Pa's story to tell. It is grounded in Ao Māori, and there is a whole lot of whakapapa behind the Ao Māori aspect as well. But essentially, the kōrero is Pa couldn't sleep, he woke up in the night. He's always got a notebook next to his bed to write down the things that are in his head. He doesn't remember writing anything down, and when he woke up in the morning, these are all the things that were on his piece of paper. So principle 1 of Tiwai Waka, caring for the whenua is the first priority. Everything else must be measured against this. Principle 2, we are not the centre of the universe, that's humans, us, but we are part of it. All living creatures are our brothers and sisters, and we are the pōtiki. We are the last born. We are the ones with the least knowledge and understanding. So we must care for everything else. Principle 3, mauri is the web of connections that sustains life. If any of these connections is weakened or broken, the mauri is less able to sustain life. The integrity of mauri and its web of connections has greater priority than the rights and needs of any individual or species. Okay? This is putting the whenua first. Principle 4, te tangata, people, are not the masters of mauri. We're the taina, we're the youngest. We are part of the mauri and embraced by it. We don't have the control. Our role is to care for mauri. In doing so, we are cared for by it. We find peace. We are at home. Principle 5. No individual person is more important than any other. Pa always talks about no ego. And any kōrero that we have is really, really strong on that there are no egos in this space. There is no room for ego. Each must contribute what they have to offer and receive what they need to be well. We are most well when we are sustained by the Māori, the web of connection that makes us who we are. And principle 6, we give special care to the tiniest living creatures. Even though they may be too small to be seen, or they might wreak havoc on us, as we have seen in the last 3 years, and evidenced by Ta Mason's story about virus. They are the foundation that keeps and sustains all life. So think about things about the microbiome. Think about how cheap it is to do an intervention which is just allowing people to be in a forest or in the bush compared to delivering them an intervention that has a cost associated with it. So, Te Waiwaka, I'm going quickly over it because it's not my kōrero to have. Pa will tell me. I'm glad he's not listening because he'll be like, yes it is, Anna. But I really encourage you to go onto the Te Waiwaka website and have a look through all the resources there and listen to Pa tell this story, because there are a number of clips on there which is his kōrero. So the stakes are pretty high at the moment, and there are some realms to consider. There's us as an individual, how you think, how you are in life, what you do, what are you going to do different, how can you make a change at this individual level. It might be just something about the way that you think about the world. It might be some little thing that you do at work. Then there's your collective around you that are closest to you, your whānau. These things that we can do in that space about collective thinking and collective actions. Whatever entity you work for, what's the culture in that environment? What are the actions you can do? What's BAU that you can make not BAU anymore? Make BAU something else. And then your society. You know, the vote thing is going to be on our minds this year, but actually, what is the most important thing that you choose to make your vote on? And if this conversation is super, super important to you, then it's about who's going to care for Papa Tuanuku, who's going to resource our ability to care for her so that we are well. And I've put relish differences there because it's actually about the fact about challenging the bits when you're like, oh, that doesn't sound right to me, or I don't agree with that. I really like those conversations because I know that I'm being constrained by my own worldview. So whenever you come across a conversation where you're like, oh, that means nothing to me, or you blank out, or it makes you get your back up, those are the conversations you should delve into, because actually it's in all the different ways that we see the world that this solution is going to come, because that's the Māori, that's the web of connections. So I've put Einstein up here as kind of like the scientist, but actually back in the day, everyone thought he was mad. His theory of relativity, when he first floated it, everyone was like, who is this guy? And yet now it is the basis of modern physics. And actually what he won his Nobel Prize for was the photoelectric thing. Sorry, it's not my area of expertise, but essentially shining the light on a metal surface and the electrons jump up. Yeah? That's what he won the Nobel Prize for, not for the theory of relativity. And that's about unseen things. That's about shooting light onto a surface and stuff jumping off the surface that we can't see. It's essentially how the moon moves the ocean. That's how we are connected to each other in this room without being seen. So even if you don't have a faith base or you're not a spiritual person and you don't believe in talking to your dead ancestors, or connecting to a god or anything like that. Kei te pai. Einstein will tell you that there is a science that will explain the connection that we have with each other and to this whenua that you cannot see. So I've got Einstein connected to Tā Mason because Tā Mason was really at the forefront of the connection between mātauranga and science, mātauranga and medicine, and then moving into Pa, who would hate the fact that he's up here, that he is moving it down to the Te Ao Māori end. But the connection of the centripetal and centrifugal way of thinking, and that actually we need both. So to end, we need a global shift in our understanding of where we fit in the order of things. Where we fit in the order of things. We are the taina. We are the youngest. We were the last here. We know the least. And it's not us that can change the environment. It is us who has to learn from the environment. And if we can do that even in a teeny tiny small way, each of us every day, then this whole climate thing will start to shift. And we will start to be more well than we are today. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Anna. That was a fantastic presentation. We haven't got a lot of time. There's a question that's come through around rongo Māori. And for people who are interested in learning more, you've talked about fire carriage, but are there resources that people could go to, or for people on the journey of discovery around?
So I wouldn't recommend that you learned rongoa by reading a document. It's definitely, you can only learn it by being in the ngahere doing the do. But Pa and Donna run regular rongoa wānanga, and they're open to all, so I'll find the link in.
Cool. Yeah. Right. Thank you, Anna. We're a little behind time. I apologise for that. That's my bad management. I'm quite good at bad management, to tell you the truth. It's one of my expertises. Our next speaker is going to come to us via video, actually. So I was pretty. So that's kind of good. So he's not waiting. So that's good. So it's a video that's waiting as opposed to the person who is waiting. So I'm really pleased about that. I feel a lot better about that. So it's Professor Alistair Woodward. Many of you will know of him, and many of you will actually know him. He's an extremely prestigious and accomplished person, a public health doctor and an epidemiologist. He's been a professor at the School of Population Health at Auckland for quite some time. He was the head of school for a long time too. He's studied, written on, and agitated for action on climate change for a very long time. Largely because of his interest in the whenua and its relationship to human health. He's got that pretty early on in the piece. He's been involved with the IPCC since the third assessment in the early 2000s and was the lead author of the chapter on Australia and New Zealand in one of their reports, the AR6 report. So he's going to appear to us, and if he was here, I'd be welcoming him really warmly. He's coming by video, and we can still welcome him very warmly. So should we do that together?
Hello, everyone. I'm Alistair Woodward, and it's my job to talk to you about AR6. I'm sorry that I can't be present at the meeting physically. Instead, I'm going to offer you a short video to tell you in a nutshell what the IPCC has been up to and offer some comments on how I think this relates to New Zealand. Let me start my slides. Right, here we are. So the main findings of AR6 and what, in my mind, these mean for New Zealand. Well, the first point to make is that the assessment report is enormous. And James Rennick, who's a colleague and was one of the scientists contributing to the AR6, claims that there were 7,700 pages of information produced during the assessment round, a number of volumes. I had no idea what 7,700 pages might look like, and so I pulled books off my bookshelf and put them on the desk here, as you can see. So an absolute, potentially overwhelming quantity of information included in this assessment report. And so I'm giving you a tip here that if you go to the synthesis report, which was published this year and is an attempt to combine in one volume the essential points from all the remainder of the assessment report, you'll find there is a summary for policymakers at the beginning. And so that's got 40 pages. That's more manageable, perhaps. And it's an attempt to sift out the nuggets of gold, the really essential aspects of the report and present them. And so that's not a bad place to start if you want to go to the report and get a sense for the flavour, the style, the content of what's included. I'm going to make some personal points. These are my own personal reflections, really, I have to say. My part in the report was to act as one of the writing team for the chapter on Australia and New Zealand, and I've been involved with assessments in the past, so this is not foreign territory to me. I always find it a fascinating experience to be part of this assessment. It's so ambitious, and the findings are so important. So what were the findings this time round? Well, I think the climate science just makes the point that we face an immense challenge. Here's one aspect to this challenge that hadn't struck me so forcefully until I read the synthesis report. Here I'm showing you that since the second half of the 19th century, the world's warmed by about 1.1 degrees. That's the bar down the bottom. The point is that that's a combination, it's the net effect of greenhouse warming, that's the greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide and methane that have been released into the atmosphere, which have a heating effect, they trap energy, and the aerosols, which on the whole have a cooling effect, they tend to reflect incoming solar radiation. So the greenhouse gases that have already been released into the atmosphere, have provided or would provide of the order of 1.5 degrees of warming. And the balance, the difference between 1.5 and 1.1 is attributable to the effect of the aerosols, that the smoke and dust that are in the atmosphere that cool the planet. The importance of this point is that, of course, we're working really hard to clean up the air, to reduce the amount of aerosol, smoke and dust and so on. And when that's achieved, as it will be, then that embedded warming will be uncovered, and global temperatures will lurch upwards. One of the reasons why people are rather pessimistic about our prospects for meeting the 1.5 guideline. Here's an infographic that just makes the same points really and adds a couple more. This point that more likely than not we'll go past 1.5, and that will happen quite soon, even under optimistic emissions scenarios. Sea level rise, of course, in many respects, one of the most important aspects of global warming, is unavoidable, just the momentum in the climate system. in terms of how oceans respond is unstoppable. These are changes that will play out over a very long time frame. And current commitments, the Paris Agreement, the NCDs, and the plans that have been made and commitments that have been made are consistent with warming of almost 3 degrees. So that's well over twice the warming that we've already experienced by 2100, unless climate action accelerates. So urgency, major problems. Another point that would be quite familiar to New Zealanders now from the IPCC report is that adaptation is now front and center stage, because all around the world we're seeing larger extreme weather events than have occurred in the past, more severe, more energetic extreme events, storms, heat waves, floods, and so on. And more certain than ever that these events are attributable to human-induced climate change. On the right-hand side there on the slide, you can see just an example of that. Luke Harrington from the University of Waikato's graphed the rainfall that we saw in Auckland in January 2023, and that's the blue line. And you can see the peak rainfall is just off the chart. It's 80% greater than anything that's been experienced before or recorded before over the last 60 years. And this is unfortunately a feature that is often reported, that it's not just that heating and flooding and rainfall intensity are unprecedented, but the surge in the peaks are most remarkable. And of course, that's what makes these events so difficult to manage. This point, I think it's so important it should be printed out and posted on the front door of every local government. That because adaptation is front and center stage doesn't mean that we can give up on mitigation. That just makes no sense, but it's been the response of many people faced with the urgencies of, the rainfall, the floods, the storms in New Zealand earlier in the year. And I like the way that the IPCC sums it up. And they said that every increment in temperature causes extra harm. So that's the first point. If we don't rein in climate change, then the severity of the floods and storms that we'll experience in the future will dwarf what we've already experienced. And then the second point, that every increment in temperature shrinks the adaptation space. In other words, makes it more difficult for us to avoid harm due to extreme events, because the margin of error is just thinner. I've put up here a picture of the Cool Roofs project, just as an example. This is a very ingenious intervention which looks to reduce indoor temperatures in parts of the world that can't afford other passive cooling devices, insulation, air conditioning, and so on, by adding a simple reflective layer to roofs, mud roofs, corrugated iron, and so on, to reduce temperatures indoors. Aditi Bunker from our university and Heidelberg has been leading this work, originally developed in Africa and tested in Africa, and now being rolled out in the Pacific. A simple approach to adapting to higher temperatures, but obviously its effectiveness is greatly reduced if as temperatures continue to climb. The assessment report, AR6, uses a term, climate resilient development, that I think is a really helpful construction. And the point is that we need to combine, to think about adaptation mitigation, and equity. They go together. The fair transition, one that combines preparing to reduce the harm of climate change as well as doing our best to reduce the extent of climate change. We've got to look for the 3-in-1 in terms of climate actions. And here's an example of just one that I think, goes some way towards meeting that ideal. The development of electric vehicles in low-income settings. And this is an example of electric rickshaws in India that are not only good for local employment, they reduce local pollution, they reduce noise, and of course they cut carbon emissions because people are using electric motors rather than diesel or petrol motors. One of the criticisms that's been made of New Zealand policies and climate, and I think it's warranted, is that we've tended to think short term. And the IPCC report over and over again emphasizes the need to look further ahead, to plan long term. And when it comes to adaptation, the argument is that rather than planning for what's most likely in the next decade or so, we should be thinking about what's the worst plausible outcome and preparing for that. It's a frame of mind that is not unfamiliar, really. If you think about insurance, that generally people think about really bad outcomes they want to avoid rather than thinking about what's most likely in the next year or so. And an example is how we approach coastal protection, where in New Zealand and other countries, design standards have been limited in the past to thinking about 1 in 100-year events. In the Netherlands, coastal protection now needs to meet standards that are based not on 1 in 100-year events, but 1 in 10,000-year events. So thinking very much longer term. What does this mean for the health system? Well, lots, but I've just picked out 3 points here. I'm sure the conference will range far more widely, but here are 3 points to think about. One is the obvious one about in the health system modeling good practice in terms of waste reduction, in terms of transport, in terms of food provision, and so on. Second point, again, a sort of obvious one, making the health system more responsive to natural disasters. I mean, that's a necessity in the near term, as well as being part of good planning longer term for climate. The third point, perhaps you wouldn't have thought so much about this, but I increasingly believe it's a really important point, communicating more effectively than we have in the past the ways in which health gains from wise, well-chosen climate action. And speed management, the newspaper article down the bottom, speed management plans in the transport sector have often been framed in terms of what people lose, framed in terms of partisan action from those opposed to cars who just want to get rid of traffic. And of course, there's much more to it than that. Jared Gilbert, who writes for the Herald, comes from Christchurch, isn't a health reporter, but he wrote this very nice piece earlier in the year about his experience of low speed zones introduced in Christchurch, which delivered all kinds of surprises, he said, in terms of increased sociability, increased opportunity for people to walk and cycle and kids to play when traffic moves less quickly. So those are the gains. If we can frame transport as a public health activity, as a public health issue, then we hopefully will be able to achieve both climate equity and local health gain in the one go, the 3-in-1 go. Well, conclusions, a mix of adverse warnings, I suppose, but some elements of rescue. Global emissions, according to the latest IPCC report, continue on what is a plainly unsustainable trajectory. Extreme events like the flooding and storms that we've seen here in New Zealand are much more likely under climate change. They now cover larger extents and they are more severe. Climate resilient development, that's the conception that I like. I think it's a good way of framing climate action. It includes equity, the fair transition is, just central, mitigation, how we prevent climate change and slow its advance, and adaptation. All those are necessary. The fourth point, it's one that maybe the IPCC report doesn't present as strongly as it could, is that there is no shortage of success and many opportunities to learn from examples of health supporting mitigation, health supporting adaptation, equitable transitions. All those things are happening, and the challenge is to bring them to into the fore and use them as the center point for discussion. I'd like to finish by recommending that if you haven't yet looked at it, check out the series of 10 short videos for Newsroom that Rod Oram prepared and were shown earlier this year. Called The Way Forward, they examine different aspects of what can be achieved, what's already being achieved in New Zealand in terms of climate action. And the video that's been downloaded most frequently, has been viewed most frequently, is episode 8, which is on the topic of learning from Māori knowledge, based on Ngāti Whātua's activities here in Auckland, at Ōrākei, but not just at Ōrākei, elsewhere in the city as well. So I'm going to just finish my sharing and say, I hope that's given you a sense of AR6, a quick run through the major findings, my sense of what the implications are for New Zealand. And if you've got questions, if you want to discuss these things with me further, I'm very happy to receive emails, to talk, give me a call. And as I said, I'm sorry that I can't be physically in person at the conference to participate in the conversations. I hope the rest of the conference goes swimmingly. Goodbye.
Well, I think that questions, we can email them to him. We should circulate his email. We will do that. We'll find a way to do that, actually. Look, we're a bit late for morning tea. I'm really sorry, it's my fault. We're still going to come back at 11, so drink and eat faster, talk faster. Okay, and see you back here at 11 o'clock. Thanks. Welcome back from morning tea. I hope you're all good and had time to chat to people and have something to eat and drink. I've still got my banana here, which I'm very pleased about. How's it going down in the hubs in Otipoti or Tautahi and Tamaki Makaurau? I hope things are going well there. We're about to start our session now. Welcome back. This is still the theme about risk and resilience and protection of Māori. And our next speaker is with us here, sitting in the front row. Karen Lavin. Karen has more than 15 years' experience working at the science policy interface on a range of issues relating to climate change and the environment. She's currently the adaptation manager at He Pūarangi Climate Change Commission and is focused on establishing the Commission's independent adaptation and monitoring function, so a pretty important job. Prior to that, she led to work on equitable transitions and emission budgets analysis at the Commission. In her former role with the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment, was that Simon Upton? Well, And Jan right before that, okay. Karen led independent environmental investigations on topics such as sea level rise and the Zero Carbon Act. She holds a PhD in environmental chemistry, so we're really looking forward to hearing from you. Kia ora, Karen, welcome. Thank you.
Speak into this one. Tina koutou katoa, called Karen Lavin tōku ingoa. I want to start by outing myself. I'm not a health expert, and I've never worked in public health or any public health organisation. And so where I come at this issue from is very much from the environmental and climate change lens. But of course, as we've heard over this morning and yesterday, climate change and health is very much interrelated, and so this topic is very relevant for our work. So I manage the adaptation work program at He Puarangi, the Climate Change Commission, and today I want to talk a bit about that work program, and in particular about the work that we're doing at the moment, where we're looking to set up an approach for how we monitor national progress on climate adaptation, and then I'll talk a little bit about how public health and wellbeing fits into that. Do I use this to the green one? Cool. So before I get into it, just thought it would be useful to tell you a little bit about the Commission and where we fit in the landscape. So the Commission was established in 2019 under the Zero Carbon Act, and you can see here the longer name for that Amendment Act. We're an independent Crown entity, so our role is that we sit at arm's length to government. And we're set up to provide independent, evidence-based advice to government and then to monitor the government's progress towards climate change goals. And I just want to emphasise that independence because it's a really important aspect for the Commission. We're quite different to a government ministry or a government agency. We can't set policy. That rightly sits with elected government officials. And so our powers are purely advisory, but we do make all our advice publicly available, so there's that accountability through that mechanism. In terms of who we are at the Commission is an expert group, not a stakeholder group, and we've got a group of experienced analysts with a range of expertise and a board of eight commissioners, 8 expert commissioners who are led by our chair, Rod Carr. So the Commission has very clear tasks and deadlines that are set out in the Zero Carbon Act, and those cover both climate mitigation and adaptation. And to date, our work has largely been focused on climate mitigation. And so we're very much in a phase now where we're starting to build up our adaptation work program, which is where my role comes into it. So this slide shows the next 18 months for us. I've got adaptation on the top, seeing as that's what I'm here to talk about, and then our mitigation tasks are on the bottom there in the dark blue. And as you can see, we've got a very busy 18 months ahead of us. We're quite a small staff of about 60, and we've got 7 pieces of work due to the Climate Minister, and then, of course, they will get made publicly available as well. You can see here that the Commission's first piece of work on adaptation is due in August 2024, and that's a progress report on the government's National Adaptation Plan. And then just to provide you with a slightly longer view as well, and this is only for the adaptation work program, following that we will then be delivering our next couple of pieces of work in August 2026, which will be the second progress report and the second National Climate Change Risk Assessment. So our adaptation role fits within a broader policy cycle, and I mentioned that the Commission's tasks are set out really clearly in legislation. That legislation also sets out a broader process that puts requirements on the government to take certain actions within certain timeframes. So there are 6 steps to this process. It starts out with a National Climate Change Risk Assessment. So that's about knowing what climate risks we face, also what opportunities we face. and then identifying where to prioritise first. And that first risk assessment was done by the government, by the Ministry for the Environment, and released in 2020, and the Commission is taking over responsibility for that from here on out. So that will be a new risk assessment will be completed every 6 years. The second step in the process is the government's National Adaptation Plan. So they're required to complete that 2 years after a risk assessment's been completed. So again, that will sit on a 6-yearly cycle. And that plan should lay out the government's objectives, strategies and policies for adapting to the effects of climate change. And so that first plan was released about a year ago, and the next one will be in 2028. After that plan is out there, it then goes into policy implementation phase, which is the phase that many government agencies are in at the moment, and then the response to that with various actors in the system acting. And then finally, monitoring and evaluation. So that's assessing how well are we actually doing at adaptation. And that's another role for the Commission, which we'll do every 2 years. As I said, the first due in August 2024. And in response to that, the government then needs to outline in writing their response, and that needs to be within 6 months of that progress report being provided to the Minister. So having a policy cycle like this is actually really useful. It's a process, it really clearly lays out those process steps, and it's an idea that was first developed in the UK, and we're seeing it, this sort of idea be taken up internationally now. And I guess this really recognises that climate change is a long-term issue and it needs to transcend political cycles, and so this is a process that helps to do that. So now honing in a bit more on the progress assessment part of that loop, which is what my team is really busy working on at the moment. So those progress assessments play a really important role in the system, as all monitoring and evaluation does. It's really important for continual learning and improvement. So we all know that even the best designed policy will not play out exactly as we expect, and so it's really important that we monitor, adapt and learn as we go. The second point here, it's also really important for accountability in the wider system, and that's why our progress assessments will be made publicly available. At the same time, we're really aware that we've got a challenge ahead of us in terms of monitoring national level progress on adaptation, and some of the reasons outlined here, not least of all that national role when adaptation and climate change impacts are inherently local. So how do we do something that is actually, do an assessment that is meaningful? The second challenge is, what is our adaptation goal? What are the outcomes that we're seeking to achieve? And this is a really big topic of discussion at the moment at the international level, with the global goal on adaptation. You might have heard talk about that. In this respect, adaptation is not like mitigation. We don't have a specific target that we're aiming for, and we don't have this one nice metric that we have with emissions, so that can be a bit of a challenge. And of course, the other thing here is data varies in quality, consistency and availability, and of course quantitative data is not going to give us a full picture of what's going on here, so the qualitative story is going to be really important. So this brings a question of how do we go about assessing if New Zealand is making progress on its adaptation goals, and how do we do that in a meaningful way? So many of you may be familiar with the logic model or theory of change, which this is, there are many ways to depict this, and this is one of them, and it's an idea that depicts the relationship between the activities you are taking and then the effects you're intending to have. So this is a really useful tool in policy development and also in monitoring and evaluation as well. So the really easy thing to monitor here is on the process side. Did the government do what it said it would do within the time frame it said it would do it? That's really simple. But what that doesn't tell us is, for one, whether that plan is a good plan in the first place, and whether we think it's got the right components to deliver the outcomes that we think it needs to deliver. And for 2, it doesn't tell us whether that plan will actually go on to deliver those outcomes. So this is the monitoring framework that we're currently working with at the Commission, and I have no doubt that it will evolve as we learn in this space. And it's framed around 3 questions, and this is actually a framework we're looking to apply to both mitigation and adaptation. So the first question is, how likely is the National Adaptation Plan to achieve the necessary outcomes? And that's really a forward-looking question. Does the plan contain what it needs to when it needs to, and is it likely to deliver what it needs to based on the information we have at the moment? And so that means looking at things like how comprehensive the plan is. Does it respond to the risks that we've identified in our National Climate Change Risk Assessment? How timely are the actions relative to the impacts we're seeing already and we know we're going to continue seeing in the future? And whether the governance and institutional arrangements are set up in a way that will support delivery. The second question here is that very much that process-based question around implementation. Is the government on track? Are policy projects sufficiently funded to deliver? So yeah, very process-based. And then the final question is here, are we observing progress towards the necessary outcomes? And that's what sort of indicators can we measure, and are they tracking in the direction that we think they should be tracking in? So that's very much that observational. It's, of course, when it comes to policy, it takes time for policy to bed in, and then, of course, for that to flow through to measurable outcomes. And so this is something that will be a bit delayed. But of course, this is where the first question here becomes really important, because it gives us that assessment of do we think it can, based on that forward picture. So you'll see, again, here the word outcomes, and that's, you know, to be able to answer any of these questions, we first need to know what those outcomes are, which is a big question in itself and is likely something we're going to need to evolve over time. We see Te Ao Māori as providing a grounding here, and given the interconnectedness between tangata and the whenua, and we're looking at the He Ara Waiora framework to see how that can help with this. And that's a wellbeing framework, but it's been designed for a policy context and designed by Māori in collaboration with Treasury. So how does public health and health equity fit into this? So we've talked a lot over the last 2 days about the significance of the climate challenge and how climate change impacts pretty much every aspect of the way that we live. And I think this diagram sums it up really nicely. So this is from a group of New Zealand and international researchers. It came out in March, very quick work that this group got onto after Cyclone Gabriel, and this shows the impacts from Cyclone Gabriel. And you can see with all the little arrows on this diagram just how interconnected everything is. Hopefully you can see it all right. Health is one of the areas in here on the left there in the blue. You can see the direct impacts there, injuries and death, cancelled outpatient appointments. And you can also trace along those lines and see the indirect impacts on health as well. And you know, the health and wellbeing impacts from losing homes, from displacement and devastated livelihoods. So it's pretty significant. So at the national scale, we have the National Climate Change Risk Assessment. I mentioned the first was released in 2020. And that risk assessment has 43 risks and 4 opportunities across 5 domains. The domains that they looked at were natural environment, built environment, human, economy, and governance. And many of the risks that relate to health and wellbeing fall in that human domain, although, as you'll understand, there's many interconnections across. And so here you can see both direct and indirect impacts, both physical and mental health and wellbeing impacts, you can see the loss and displacement and how that impacts social cohesion, identity, sense of belonging. And then also in the physical health space, the injury and mortality from extreme events, heat-related illnesses, respiratory illnesses from wildfires. It's, this is quite significant. And I will just note at the bottom there, of the 4 opportunities that were identified in the National Climate Change Risk Assessment, one of them was health-related as well, and so that's the one listed at the bottom. So the government's National Adaptation Plan contains 20 objectives and 117 actions, and of the 20 objectives, one of them is very directly health-related, and that's the one listed here, that the health sector is prepared and can support vulnerable communities affected by climate change. And there are 2 actions there and 1 supporting action directly related to health. And as I said before, many interconnections across other actions within there, particularly around supporting people and communities. And I won't go into this in detail. Vicktoria spoke to this a bit yesterday, and of course the Commission doesn't own the NAP. We're responsible for independently assessing it. So where to from here for our work? So we're very much in the initial phases for our adaptation work program, and the next steps for us will be putting this monitoring framework into action. A big part of that, you can see how vast this problem is, the types of information we're going to need to be looking at to help us understand how well we're doing, and so a big part of what we'll be doing will be through engagement and getting input from people who are experts in various areas. I've noted down here some of the questions that we're looking to ask. Outcomes, I talked a bit about that, but also what gaps do you see in the system and what barriers are you facing? And how, the question is, how can we help to plug those and make things easier for you? I've got a big question around how the Commission can monitor in a way that's useful. Of course, we've got this role at a national level, but if we can do it in a way that's helpful more broadly, then that has multiple benefits then in that work. What indicators will show if we're making progress, and what data can we use to help us support that? And of course, we wouldn't be limited if by data. We'll start out by looking for what is an ideal set of indicators, and then data will be secondary to that. So I'm happy to take some questions, but also just, happy to take questions, but I'm really here to listen, and we don't know how we're going to work through this, so I'm conscious that you're the experts as well, so really keen for any thoughts on these questions as well.
Thank you, Karen.
Thank you.
There are a few questions coming through on Slido. The Climate Commission model, how different is it from the UK model?
It's pretty similar, and I think the main thing is within the Act there's the very clear provisions in the Act as to what we're required to do and when we're required to do it by. But in terms of the New Zealand Commission, so there's actually a number of commissions internationally. In terms of the New Zealand Commission, we're probably the one with the broadest mandate, and that's because we've got roles relating to ETS settings, for example, so giving the government advice on that. There's talk at the moment as to whether the Commission should have a role relating to agricultural emissions price settings. So we do have a bit of a broader mandate than most other commissions.
Can I ask just a personal question just about, my understanding of the UK model is that the advice the Climate Commission has given over the years, even during the transition and that madness of the Tory government when things were really, they've all been accepted unanimously by the Parliament in the UK. Is it the same here?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the UK there's definitely been times where the system has been tested, and so we've seen that. Some of the advice that we're seeing from the UK, we're seeing them repeat their messages, and I think that's just the challenge of the times that we're in, is you know, things like cost of living start coming up, and there are other challenges. In the UK, it's the energy issues, isn't it? So
there's a couple of related questions to that. One from Robin. The impression on the ground is that the government is not moving fast enough given the climate crises here, and to some extent there's another question that relates to what have been the specific practical learnings for the Commission given the weather events of the recent past here, but this feeling that the government's not moving fast enough given those events and others globally, and what more could the Climate Commission do to try and, you know, sort of speed that up a bit?
Yes, yeah, and I mean, of course, we make all our advice publicly available, and so you'll all be able to see that, and that's where that this is how the system works, is we provide that advice publicly, and then the accountability comes from that transparency. I think in terms of that question of, is the government acting fast enough, I think that's exactly what our monitoring role is, and I wouldn't like to preempt that work. It's really important for the Commission to make sure that we do step through that evidence and form that view, and so but be looking out for that in July and August next year, which is when both our monitoring pieces will be coming out.
Okay, so how often are you monitoring? Just
for our mitigation monitoring is annual, and then our adaptation monitoring will be every 2 years.
Oh, every 2 years. Okay, all right.
Yeah.
Good. Okay. There's a sort of a bit of a pointed question putting you on the spot a bit as a public servant. Are you a public servant?
I guess technically, but I'd like to say that I sit in an independent organisation.
Oh, okay. So I'll ask the question then. It says, how are the government doing at the moment? And how will progress be affected if there's a change of government? It's a kind of a bit of a pointed question for...
Yeah, that is a bit,
you don't have to
a bit
answer
political.
If you feel a bit
And
difficult.
yeah, I mean, I think what I would say is the Zero Carbon Act, which sets up this process, you mentioned earlier today, was unanimously voted on in the House, and so I think that's one aspect to just keep in mind on this. Of course, it's a completely different thing, and different governments will have different views on how we go about reaching the goals that are set out in the Act, and that's, I think, where we'll see the differences come in.
Okay.
But I think in the adaptation space, generally, I mean, you see events like Cyclone Gabriel, it's hard to not act when you see events like that. You know, the political, the public narrative is just so strong, isn't it? So,
from a practical point of view, you may not be the right person to ask, but that interplay between central government and local government when it comes to decisions around adaptation, does the Commission have a view on that, or is it gone into that space at all?
So I talked a bit earlier about, you know, and asking the question of if the plan's a good plan, looking at those governance and institutional arrangements, and that central government, local government one is a big part of that, I think. You know, local government is finding it really tricky, and so it's a question of, well, how do we get them the right levers and tools so that, you know, we can be making sure that we're not putting new developments in places that we know are exposed to climate change impacts. So that's something that we'll be particularly looking at quite closely in our monitoring work.
Do you work with local government specifically, or is it a bit hands-offish?
No, so we, engagement's a really big part of what we do. For our adaptation work program in particular, there will be some quite significant engagement with local government, and there are some really good forums that we can work through as well. So there's ACAN, which is the Aotearoa Climate Adaptation Network, which is local government professionals. There's a few different forums that we can work through, and then of course we'll get out across the country as well, get out of Wellington. So
okay, cool. I was asked, I've got this red thing here. Do you have any questions, Rick, given your work with Becca and local government that you'd like to ask? Shall I throw this to you? Or? So I've been wanting to throw this.
Thanks for the update. Obviously, you've got a mammoth task, and as you say, there's a lot to be defined around what that monitoring framework is. And it probably echoes a lot of what you just said, but I think we're here to offer our help and support to that as well in terms of getting to the nitty-gritty or a sector basis. But so it's not really a question, is it? It's more of a statement. I'm trying not to put you on the spot
comments
either.
too.
Yeah. But I think for me, there's still, and we talked about it yesterday in lots of different forms, there's still a lot of disconnect between central, local government and what health needs and what public wants. And it's if there's anything the Commission can do to help remind government agencies around that interagency activity is the only way we're really going to tackle the wicked problems of adaptation, net zero and equity. So yeah, it's probably definitely more of a comment than a question.
Thanks, Rick. One last very quick question. Other organisations, perhaps, who have a monitoring role of the government's response to your recommendations, are there other organisations that actually take on that responsibility to monitor and report on the government's response to the Climate Commission's recommendations?
Yes, yeah, there are. So James Shaw mentioned earlier, there's the Climate Change Chief Executives Board, which is sort of set up to sort of oversee. You know, he talked about the vertical silos and the need to better look across central government agencies, and so that's sort of what their role is, and part of that is in that monitoring space. So yes, we're having conversations with them about how we do our work in a way that doesn't duplicate, but also that maintains our independence, because that's number one for us. So.
Sure. Well, look, thanks, Karen. We're really grateful to you for coming, and we really value the work of the Commission. And please send them our support. And we're really grateful for your contribution today. So.
Thank
you. We're moving on to our panel session to close this third theme, and I'm going to hand over to Vicktoria to manage that. Is that the right thing to do? Yeah.
Kia ora anō. So this panel is really looking at climate change risk. And just before we get into the kōrero today, I just really want to acknowledge all those affected by the January floods and Cyclone Gabriel, and the ongoing weather events, particularly that Tairāwhiti and the Hawke's Bay, which is where a lot of my whānau are experiencing. And they're still experiencing significant stress. And I do think that we really need to recognise the mental health impacts as well as the physical health impacts that are faced through these challenges. And unfortunately that the research is showing that we're right, and that it is really impacting on those parts of our society that are already experiencing inequity and health issues. As we've discussed, climate change is widely considered as the number one risk to human health. And as was illustrated, thank you, Karen, on one of your slides, healthcare delivery during weather events can be compromised and is disrupted. We also need to ensure that we're planning services based on what we know about climate change. And what those expected implications are under various scenarios. So as I mentioned yesterday, we are starting to do some work in healthcare sector scenarios that are really looking at health impacts under those scenarios, so we can be planning our services around it, and that's across the sector. So that's from publicly funded hospital treatments to aged care facilities to public health services and all of those types of things. And also we must mention the considerations on workforce resilience and as I said, the immediate and ongoing mental health issues, and that's within our community but also within the staff and the teams that we have. We are pleased to note the inclusion of a health lens in the National Adaptation Plan, which really begins to recognise the connection between a stable climate and human health. We also expect to see a closer connection in the second round of the emissions reduction plan. We have an amazing panel of experts to share their insights and knowledge, and I spoke yesterday about what we're doing in Te Whatuora. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce each person with their bio, and then they're going to speak. And we get to start with the fabulous Cassie, Welch and Rosa at Verkasalo. are both health and all policy advisors based in Te Manaora, Community and Public Health, and part of the National Public Health Service, and Te Whatuora in Waitaha, Canterbury. Cassie and Rosa's mahi in the health and all policies teams mean that they work closely with local partners, including local and regional council, to influence determinants of health. Through long-standing collaboration with Christchurch City Council and Environment Canterbury, the Health and All Policy team was asked to explore the health and wellbeing impacts of climate change in Waitaha, Canterbury, which was culminated in the recently released report, Climate Change in Health in Waitaha, Canterbury. Over to you, Cassie and Rosa.
Kia ora koutou, and mihi Victoria for the introduction, and a warm hello from Aotearoa Christchurch to everyone else joining. We're really grateful and excited to be here to learn a little bit more about this important mahi and to share a little bit about what we've been up to in the past couple of months. So like Victoria said, we're fortunate to work in the Health and All Policies team here at Te Manaora for Community and Public Health. And in the project we're going to be talking about, we took a health and all policies approach, which meant that we could work collaboratively with our partners and support our local and regional council to ensure that climate actions are designed in a way that support equity and consider the wider determinants of health. And as has been talked about quite a lot today already, the environment in whenua is inseparable from human health and hauora.
So the work that we've done came out of our relationship and conversations with local and regional council, and they wanted to make sure that it was really clear the relationship between health and well-being and climate change, and that relationship would be better understood. The work kind of evolved out of the existing risk assessment that had been done in Canterbury, but had a limited focus on the kind of human impacts of climate change. So our work was aimed to kind of expand that section of the risk assessment. It was done very quickly, and that was in order for the report to be released so that it could support our regional and local council in their long-term decision-making and long-term planning processes, which kicked off earlier this year.
So throughout the process, it was really important for us to work closely with both our local and regional council. And we also involved some of our health promotion staff and our public health analyst staff from within our public health organisation. And we formed a working group with both staff from Christchurch City Council and Environment Canterbury. And this working group guided and shaped the direction and contents of what we ended up producing. And that was really important to make sure that the final report was something that would be of actual use to our partners.
We were also fortunate to connect with a number of academics and experts working in this space, people who have worked in the climate change space for many years, and with their support and insight, we were able to shape the way that we worked. So we're very grateful for our working group and the academic and other experts that supported us, as we're definitely not experts in this space, even though Victoria introduced us as experts, which is very sweet. But for us, this work has been a big learning process, and we have been guided by lots of people who have already worked in this space for many years.
We wanted to use a public health perspective throughout this process, so we also considered how climate hazards would impact different population groups in Waitaha, Canterbury. As we know, and has been a key kind of kōrero in this conference already, the effects of climate change will be experienced inequitably, in many cases with the most affected people being those who already experience inequitable health and well-being outcomes. And for us in public health, as in many areas of the health system, promoting equity is a critical cornerstone of our work.
What we've produced isn't a complete health impact assessment as such, as we haven't assessed a specific policy, but what we've done the first two steps of a health impact assessment. So we've screened the possible
risks associated with climate change in Waitaha, Canterbury. And we've done a scoping, which has basically examined and collated a lot of what we already know. And this has been made into our interim report. It uses a lot of New Zealand and local-based literature and international literature, and we hope it will be a useful resource as a step for future assessments.
Yeah. And yeah, throughout this process, we've kind of learned and gained the understanding that health and well-being is a helpful way to engage with climate change, as it can be quite an overwhelming and daunting big topic. But bringing a health and well-being lens means that we can think more carefully about people and what the impacts might be on populations, community and whānau. So we're really excited to see how health can continue to engage in this kōrero and the broader climate sense and inform the coming climate actions. So thanks, Victoria.
Kia ora koroa. Just remember that Slido is open, so please feel free to put your questions in as we work through. Our next speaker today is Ben Sims. Ben is a senior climate change and resilience consultant at Tonkin Taylor. Ben has worked on several climate risk and adaptation assessments in New Zealand and the Pacific, and was part of the team that undertook the Aotearoa National Climate Change Risk Assessment. He has an interest in how health can be assessed through climate risk assessments, and is currently studying a Master of Public Health part-time at the University of Auckland. Over to you, Ben.
Thank you, Victoria. Kia ora koutou, ko Ben toku ingoa. So I'm very excited to be here to share my experience working on these risk assessments. So I've got an interest in systematic and cascading risks, and I've done a bit of thinking about how health can be better integrated into these assessments. And a lot of the current frameworks that we use are based on the IPCC understanding of risk, and that looks at risk in quite a linear and high-level way. And it has a really strong focus on direct risks. So such as like using a traffic light to rate risks. So you could look at drinking water and the risk of flooding, and then at 2050 it might be rated as moderate, and 2100 it might be rated as high. And these assessments, including the National Climate Risk Assessment, they provide a really good foundation for moving forward and for building awareness among all these agencies. So climate risk is on the radar now in a way that it wasn't before all these assessments were done. But we need to dive deeper, and Cassie and Rosa's work's a good example of that. So I think the complex and indirect risks, such as long-term health risks, they probably aren't being assessed because they're much harder to measure. They require a lot more resources to measure and assess. And it's very important to measure climate risk, but we also need to use the right methods to measure it. And we need to think carefully about what we mean by climate health risk and how it should be assessed. So there are a variety of assessment methods, and this could include collecting stories from communities and their experiences. And this was presented on yesterday in the presentation on well-being in the Pacific. And then systems thinking approaches, such as the diagram that Karen included in her presentation. And then bespoke risk rating approaches designed for the health sector, such as the approach that Cassie and Rosa presented on, and also climate-related health impact assessments. And at the Climate and Health Conference 2 years ago, Helen Brown presented on a method that is designed for the health sector and has been used in Australia, and I recommend you having a look at that if you're interested in this. And another important thing is epidemiological research to understand what the burden of disease is from climate hazards. But the approach that is used should depend on the context and what data we have, and also the cultural context, as Anna mentioned this morning. If we look at one climate hazard, flooding, it's front of mind given the horrific experiences we've seen this year. And in New Zealand, it's our most common climate hazard. Most of our urban centres are at risk, and it's estimated that there are 700,000 people around Aotearoa that are at risk of flooding. And flood risk disproportionately affects Māori, low-income households, and deprived areas. And there are short-term health consequences from flooding, such as loss of life and injury, and impacts on drinking water. And these are being assessed, and flood prevention approaches are designed with these in mind. But the long-term health risks of flooding are being insufficiently accounted for and considered. And flooding is a risk that's managed outside of the health sector, but there are some major long-term health consequences. And these include mental health impacts, as we've heard many times, and also things like infections from mouldy homes. And if we look at epidemiological assessments, which is one of the methods that I mentioned, there's limited evidence on long-term epidemiological risk in New Zealand. And I think this should be one of the research priorities, given New Zealand's extreme exposure to flood risk. And there are lots of global examples here. So in the UK, there was a national cohort study on flooding and health, and this followed flood-affected people for 3 years, and that found that even after 3 years, there were increased rates of depression and PTSD. So having better quality risk information is really important to reduce risk in a more targeted way. And this will also help to design adaptation actions that can deliver much stronger health benefits. Thanks.
Feeling very privileged with this panel of experts today, and I'm going to call you experts because you all are. Our next speaker is Dr. Claire Salter. Claire works in environmental health at He Pūtaiao He Tangata, the Institute of Environmental Science and Research, or ESR, as many of us know it, in Ōtautahi, Christchurch. Claire is a public health medicine registrar in the New Zealand College of Public Health Medicine Training Program. Just a little bit about ESR. ESR is a Crown Research Institute specialising in science for communities. In addition to research, some of the environmental health team provide scientific analysis, guidance, risk assessment and advice to the National Public Health Service, Te Whatu Ora, on environmental health issues such as climate change, fresh, recreational and wastewater, air quality and emergency management. Over to you, Claire.
Ngā mihi kia koutou, ko Claire Salter tōku ingoa. I've been working with some colleagues at ESR, Nettie Bolton and Sudesh Sharma, on a very small scoping project to complement a larger HRC project about heat and child health, which Nettie is working on, as many of the others in this conference. The scoping project came about because I was trying to think of how recommendations from projects could actually get a chance of being listened to or actioned, and I wondered if understanding more about the policy context might help us with that. So we conducted some workshops and some discussions with people who were interested or had experience of heat health, and we created a systems map, which was a causal loop diagram, and it's really just telling a story and showing what people's perceptions of the policy context of heat and heat waves were at that point in time. The themes were nothing that hasn't been mentioned already or that was unexpected, which I think is worth mentioning, that we keep saying the same things, and that a lot of people seem to be on the same page in this group, but I guess it's how do we reach wider than this group. So the themes were there are gaps in Aotearoa specific evidence relating to heat health. There are limited public awareness of the health risks of heat waves, and competing priorities for governments, such as the cost of living crisis, COVID, other climate devastating emergencies that have been happening recently. This has affected the government's interest in heat, and that affects the time and resources given to heat, and that affects organisations' abilities to work across sectors, to collaborate with communities, share expertise, and produce culturally safe and equitable responses. There has been some planning for managing heat waves, but to date, the implementation of plans is pretty limited so far. So we need, the last theme was that we need to understand and address the aspects of the wider policy system that affect equitable outcomes. So this doesn't occur in isolation. It's part of a bigger system where systemic racism exists and neoliberal resourcing efficiency occurs, and there's short-term thinking. So once we made the systems map, we reviewed it, and we tried to flip it the other way around and thought, well, what conditions would support equitable, inclusive, and collective action for mitigating the adverse health outcomes for heat waves? And this is where the systems thinking part is all about. In addition to policies and resources and relationships and who has power, we highlighted how the way people are thinking and people's values and narratives about health inequities and heat waves are shaping the policies. So in terms of the way people are thinking, the importance of collaborating to create a shared worldview of what's important, and that's that binocular view and the overlapping Venn diagram that Johnny talked about, that we're all on the same page with what we want to achieve with equity and climate justice and whenua first and upholding Te Tiriti Waitangi. And regarding relationships and power dynamics, again, prioritising Te Tiriti Waitangi and mai tiki mai Paiora approaches and strengthening mechanisms for Māori governance came up, as well as genuine power sharing, building trust, relationships with diverse communities. And then in terms of policies and resourcing, implementing plans, resourcing Indigenous environmental practices, collaboration, coordination across sectors and with communities, risk communication, research and evaluation. And lastly, finding synergies between heat health and other climate adaptation and mitigation policies to maximise efficiencies and what Alistair talked about with the 3-in-1 benefits. So the hope is that by understanding more about the system, we can understand more about how to produce equitable health outcomes relating to heat, and understand more about the way people are thinking about these topics to understand how to talk about them and how and where to change in the system. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Claire. Our last panellist is Catelyn Richards, and she's joining us in the room from Tasmania. Catelyn is a proud registered nurse, humanitarian, passionate advocate for environmental sustainability, and co-founding director of Climate Action Nurses. Through her work volunteering with organisations such as the Oak Tree Foundation, AusAid, the Australian College of Nursing and the Climate and Health Alliance, Catelyn fervently believes that leadership must be deeply grounded in a desire to improve the communities in which we live and work. Catelyn is a 2022 Westpac Future Leaders Scholar, completing her Master of Leadership, Health and Human Sciences through the University of Tasmania. She has presented on early career nurse leadership and environmental sustainability at a range of conferences, including the Australian College of Nursing National Nursing Forum and the South Pacific Nurses Forum. Catelyn was a finalist in the 2023 Tasmanian Young Achiever Award. Over to you, Catelyn.
Thank you, Victoria. I'd firstly just like to pay respects to the Manu Whenua and also pay my respects and acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I'm from, Lutchwida, Tasmania, which is the Palawa, Pakana, or the continuing Aboriginal custodians of that land. I feel so welcomed to have, by everyone, to come here, and I thank you deeply for allowing me to come and speak. Prior to working with Climate Action Nurses and the Australian Nursing and Midwifery Federation, I was working in a large metropolitan hospital in Victoria as a registered nurse on the floor, as they like to say. And I was nursing during the Black Summer bushfires, which I'm sure many of you would have seen on the news between 2019 and 2020. And those events collided with a series of heat waves in Victoria at the time that saw some parts of the city reach 44.1 degrees, so it was very, very hot. The air that they've researched after the time revealed that the air particulate matter was incredibly high. So it was hot, sticky, thick and unbreathable, toxic air. And I remember being relieved that I could go to work because I had access to very good air conditioning, and the air inside was clear and cold. So it's pretty remarkable that it was a relief to be escaping, and I know and acknowledge that for many people experiencing extreme weather events, that's not the case. I recall going to a shift during the heat waves, and it was a morning shift, and I came on to hear that our air conditioning system in the hospital had actually failed overnight, which had sent our digital epicentre, it had plunged it into being completely down. So we were purely run on digital. So this health system that was quite progressive was now completely out. So the air conditioning had failed, which had plunged the system down, and so we had no access to medication charts, we had no access to our patient files, any care plans. The outgoing nurse handed over to me, he didn't know the names of his patients. Such was our reliance on this high-class technology. I remember thinking at the time, this is quite strange, and the conversations were around each of those singular events, not about the widespread holistic issues that were causing those events to happen in the first place. And I couldn't stop thinking about it, particularly as an early career nurse and somebody that has aspirations of leadership. This was the future that we would be leading under, and of course, several months later, we were all plunged collectively into a global pandemic, and I was quite literally plunged into a full suit of plastic and an N95 mask, and again started to think a little bit more really about what it would look like. When we talk about the risks of climate change and extreme weather events on health, we often look at the patients, and it should be people and patient focused. But also we need to think about the healthcare practitioners that will be responsible for delivering care during those events as well. Being somebody that doesn't like reinventing the wheel, I wanted to learn more about the healthcare practitioners' experience of delivering care during extreme weather events, but I didn't want to re-traumatise people that had already spoken about their experiences, so I set about uncovering what the literature already said about healthcare practitioners, specifically nurses, and their experiences in delivering care during extreme weather events. So undertook a review of that literature to explore some of those common themes under the guise of trying to understand what it will be like nursing under the Anthropocene. I don't know how I'm going for time. Just let me
You're doing great. Keep going. Okay. Look at Helen over there. She'll tell you if you're out of time.
Oh, great. Wonderful. So that piece was looking at 15 different studies, and some of the research that came out from the Christchurch earthquakes were incredibly telling about the nurses' experience. and effectively it informs how we can go about preparing our workforce, and made some recommendations which I might speak to a little bit further on.
Awesome. Amazing. So we've got a few prepared questions that we've worked with the panel, so I'll just work through those now, and we'll keep looking at Slido. So, you know, if any questions do come up, please pop them into Slido. I think I might start with you, Cassie and Rosa. So why do you think it's important for the health lens or a health and all policies approach to be taken in regards to climate change?
Yeah, it's a good question. So two of the important parts about health and all policies is taking a collaborative approach. So working with a range of people across sectors and using an integrated approach as well. And both of these elements are important to address just the complexity of climate change. Because the responsibility for actions falls across a range of organisations, agencies, roles. So it's impossible to just narrowly look at the issue. Health also has a really important role to play, significant role to play. That's, I guess, why we're here. But like most determinants of health, the work sits outside of the health system itself. So we can't really do this work without working alongside mana whenua and iwi, council, civil defence, community groups, schools, businesses. The list could go on for a long time. And the last point I'll make is that the health impacts are probably also more tangible for people and communities to understand. Sometimes climate change is a big, broad topic that's kind of hard to think about how it applies to individuals. But when we think about health and things like mental health, it can be a little bit easier to break down and understand for ourselves.
Cool. That sounds a little bit to me like systems thinking. So a question for you, Claire, is like, can you give us some examples of what systems conditions might look like in practice?
Yeah, and I would just add that when the people I spoke to, they all just kept talking about the importance of collaboration, coordination, which is really what the health in all policies approach is. It feels a bit nebulous to just talking about just the conditions and systems. So I thought it might be useful to some of the examples people gave me, and they included looking at the difference in different suburbs with different tree coverage in different suburbs and trying to address the inequities of the way that trees were in cities. And they talked about the narrative, how do we change the narratives around heat waves and health impacts, and the information, including heat, in climate change communication and conversations, and having a shared language so we can talk about this in an accessible way. Because especially with emergency management, there are a lot of complicated terms that get thrown around. But NEMA do have a document on consistent messaging as well, which might be useful. And they're working on making their communications much more accessible. And there are some, Te Whatu Ora Waitaha are working on a heat plan, which is going to be really useful, I think, for other rohe to have a look at when it's published. And there is guidance from the Ministry of Health on planning for heat waves. So there are some tangible examples of how to do this out there. And then I think the other thing that was mentioned is the social determinants of health kept coming up, especially housing in terms of heat and people living without any ways of cooling or transporting themselves to anywhere that's cool. So keeping advocating on the social determinants of health is quite an important part in public health, especially around housing. Yeah,
that's a really interesting one, isn't it, about HVAC and your example, Catelyn, about wanting to go to work. I mean, we all love our jobs, don't get me wrong, but that's where the HVAC system is. And I think that we also need to be thinking about community systems of HVAC and how we're providing that for our communities in episodes of extreme heat, which may cost money. So a question for you, Ben. We know that risk assessments should inform adaptation planning, and we need to better integrate health into these processes, but how much should we spend to reduce climate risk?
It's a big question, and we've touched on kind of cost and spending throughout this conference. And unfortunately, we do need to kind of speak the language of economics. That's how these decisions are made. And if we look at the North Island weather events, Treasury estimated that those cost up to $14.5 billion, but that costing didn't include health impacts, such as mental health impacts. And it's probably because Treasury needed to do the analysis quickly, the data wasn't available, and there's limited awareness of long-term health impacts. But including health in the costing is quite important. And we can look at an example from Australia. The RACP, the Royal Australasian College of Physicians, they did research looking at bushfire risk, and they estimated that there might be a bushfire, there's likely to be a bushfire in the next 10 years that will cost $10 billion. And that $10 billion includes health risks or health impacts such as hospitalisation from respiratory disease. And what does $10 billion cost mean? Well, that means in terms of economic logic that up to $10 billion should be spent to reduce that risk. And so that's why it's really important to have some quantitative data available, so it can be included in things like cost-benefit analyses. And the outcome of that is, we'll be able to secure more money to reduce these health risks, particularly health risks that come from big projects such as infrastructure projects.
Kia ora. Kia ora, Ben. Catelyn, a question for you. What does the literature tell us about the nurse's role during extreme weather events, and what was learned from experience through those events?
Yeah, it was interesting looking at the publications that on this specific topic, and it really varied. Obviously, there were different natural disasters, and I say natural disasters with because that was the terminology that was used to identify this literature. I still had to go back to the IPCC and look at different extreme weather events such as heat, which wouldn't have been, and bushfires, which wouldn't have been typically covered under that historic language. But it really varied depending on what type of extreme weather event was experienced. Something that was really revealing from all of them, which covered earthquakes, Hurricane Sandra, the bushfires in Australia, the Black Saturday bushfires, not the Black Summer, it was the concept of resilience and what that actually means. And I think it's a word that we talk about a lot. And of course, there was participants across most of the studies described that they felt ill-prepared for the extreme weather event. It's difficult to know exactly how we could prepare for such extreme events and what it meant to be practicing. One thing that stood out to me was that often nurses weren't recognised as being victims of the event themselves, so there was very much this sense of hero victimhood, of the moral obligation to attend work, even knowing that your own home had been destroyed is quite profound. And in some instances, nurses would attend their shift to find that them and scant other colleagues were there at work because others had decided that they didn't want to come to work. Which comes back to that very real question of would you go to work if you knew that your home had been completely destroyed? And how do we support and compel our workforce to feel supported in attending work during those events, which then sort of talked a little bit about the leadership that they experienced, and certainly the leadership where it was strongest was where they had trust in their leaders prior to the extreme weather event, and really good solid communication during the extreme weather event from their leaders as well. So things as simple as knowing that their family was safe so that they could stay at work was really, really important. And it's basic things like that was actually quite surprising in situations where that wasn't available. So resilience is about preparing and understanding what the risks are, absolutely, but it's also building the infrastructure within organisations. And I talk about infrastructure not from a building perspective, but from a, from the organisation, the people in the organisation, and the importance of fostering good working relationships prior to those events.
It's quite heavy, right? Like, that's some pretty heavy thinking, but trust me, we're going to finish on a question that's going to lift us. I was looking for our friend and colleague Ken to see if he could do some of that Māori shifting, because I can't remember the thing he did for us yesterday that we all failed at terribly, but we might just need to keep that in our minds as we go through some of these questions. And there are some great questions coming through on Slido, so thank you, team. And I'll stick with you, Catelyn, and this question's for everybody, but we'll start with you. So what are the speakers' thoughts on including community voices in the climate health adaptation, and how would you go about it?
I want to speak to the broader community, but I know that my learned colleagues will probably have done a lot more consultation, and so I can really only speak to the area that I feel most confident, which is in nursing, and certainly understanding what what has already been exhibited or what we've already learned is a great place to start, so that we're not reinventing the wheel each time we need to look at community values. But also, I think there is a growing recognition that we need to understand the community, and I feel like, particularly in Australia, that's not. We've got a lot of work to do in terms of understanding land, but also the traditional connections to that land as well. So,
cool. Yeah, you can go next.
I think it's really important. Adaptation planning documents are often not the most interesting documents to read. So I think having stories from communities is really important for framing the whole process. And also, it can bring out more nuance that a kind of cold risk screening couldn't. So I'm thinking about my work that I've done in the Pacific around this. I've done some work in the outer islands of Papua New Guinea, looking at climate risk and some very isolated, vulnerable communities there. And they're vulnerable, but they're also very resilient because they've had to, live in these environments for thousands of years. So I think if you collect stories, you can also emphasize that, that there's a lot of resilience as well in the communities, and bring out these stories that you haven't, and this information that you can't capture using these more academic techniques.
Cool. My colleagues in Christchurch, I'll leave it up to you to determine your order.
We would agree with what we've all said, but community engagement and community voice is so important in this mahi, and we want to make sure that our plans for the future, our climate actions, aren't producing harm unintentionally, and we wouldn't be able to test that without actually talking to people on the ground and hearing stories and hearing what actually happened for people, and especially since there is some limited data, or we don't have all the information about what exactly is happening in different contexts. So yeah, I think in order to be able to create a plan and a response that's needed, we need to be able to talk to community and hear what they care about in terms of the future and their relationship with the climate and the environment.
Yeah, it came up time and time again with people mentioning it in discussions in this project. And the few things that came up that people said were that it needs to start from conception and go all the way through to evaluation of projects. So, and specifically, someone gave an example of if you create a project and then you just give it to different groups. So they were specifically talking about a Pacifica delivery of a project, but they haven't conceived the project. That's not a Pacifica approach. It needs to be their idea in the first place. And someone mentioned examples from COVID vaccination, which has already been mentioned today, but I also was involved in COVID vaccination. And when I think having relationships with trusted places, trusted faces, trusted community leaders. So the health promoters in the National Public Health Service have some good relationships with trusted leaders in the community, and they're good people to engage with. And again, in the COVID vaccination, it was also about relinquishing power as well and giving up resources rather than just engaging, but actually sharing power. Yeah.
Some really interesting themes, and I do think that storytelling is a really big part of it as well. And how do we hear the quieter voices? Do you know what I mean? Because we do hear from the louder voices a lot, but how do we actually engage with some of those quieter voices? And as a mother of a teenager, you know, like how do we hear from them and not just the wonderful young people that are out marching, but the other ones who are quietly thinking about it? Yeah, that's my 2 cents on that one. Try not to answer questions, but can't leave that one alone.
Yeah, and in the Christchurch City Council, we've got an example of involving youth in coastal hazard identification, haven't they? Which is really cool. You can look up.
A question for you, Claire. Do you feel that town planners and local councils are aware of the importance of reducing heat islands by planting?
I did speak with some people from local government, and they were aware of urban forests and canopy cover and reducing urban heat islands. But the theme that they were telling me was this from higher up, the powers that be, what priorities the agencies had, but it was more possibly the public lack of awareness rather than organisational lack of awareness is what I heard. But again, mine was a very small project, so I can't speak to what all the different local authorities might be thinking. But some of the ones I spoke to were aware, but they didn't feel like they had particular backing, higher in central government maybe.
Cool. Cassie and Rosa, what are some examples of climate actions, either mitigative or adaptive, great words those, that have population health co-benefits?
Kia ora. Well, I think James mentioned a few this morning as well, but I guess there's many climate actions that have those co-benefits, and I think a few of our people today and yesterday talked about some of them, but I guess some big ones, you know, decarbonizing the transport system, reducing emissions, you know, encouraging more active transport, reducing kind of pollution in the air. All of those things have great co-health benefits and climate benefits. Another one, encouraging and enhancing social connectedness, community. You know, we know that having stronger communities ensure that better community resilience and are protective against some of the worst impacts of climate change. So, you know, and that can allow for community members to support one another and, you know, help those who are most affected in any climate event. Also, you know, we've talked a lot today about our natural environment, and the focus on protecting and restoring natural environments is really important for our health as well. Creating green spaces, enhancing biodiversity, you know, all have co-benefit human health impacts. And so there's, it's a limit. I could go on, but there's so many. So there are lots of opportunities to address climate and health together.
Fantastic. I think that's lifting us up for our last round. So each individual is going to answer this question before we break and head back to David. So we'll start with you, Cassie, and then we'll pass it through the room. What brings you hope?
Kia ora. Well, working in this space, as much as that when you talk about it with people outside and working in climate change, people would think that'd be quite depressing, but actually I found that this work has been really uplifting and hopeful. And part of it is because we've had the opportunity to meet so many dedicated, smart, compassionate people working in this space. And that gives me a lot of hope. There's so many people doing amazing work, and we're all, chipping away at something. And I feel like at some point it's all going to weave together into a beautiful, something. And that gives me a lot of hope. I think similar, the word convergence from Johnny's talk yesterday was like a big word for me. I'm like, yeah, we are, but there's a convergence of people and ideas. And I think we're weaving a beautiful future. That's my hope. Yeah.
Rosa.
Yeah, my answer was very similar to what Cassie discussed a little bit before on the co-benefits, that there's so many opportunities that we have that have traditionally been labelled as climate change responses, so things to do with the transport system. And I think, yeah, there's a huge opportunity for us to reframe those as public health responses, because there's just so much overlap between the two. They're kind of inseparable. So when we improve our environment and whenua, we improve our health too. So yeah, when we realise these opportunities, when we put these into place, we've got a lot of benefit or gain to have. So it's really hopeful and helpful for me.
Claire, you're up.
I think I was feeling like everything I was saying is just like a broken record of what everyone else has been saying this whole conference. But then really that's quite hopeful that there's, as Cassie said, there's a lot of people on the same page. And I guess in terms of systems thinking, it's about getting this shared view of what we want to achieve. And I feel like it's just expanding the number of people in that who are in that wanting to achieve climate justice, really. There are people and there are wins, and we've talked about some of the wins, and especially with like putting more cycle. There's a new cycle lane that's just popped up in Rolleston Ave. Things do keep happening, and the council are funding health in their impact. So the things are moving, but I guess we just need to understand where it's not moving, where it is moving, and how it can influence the people who have the power to make the change. And that's why I think systems thinking can be useful. Yeah.
Kia ora, Claire. Ben, your turn.
I think working in the space, it can be hard to find hope, but so it's a good question. I think an important way to end it. And I think looking at how much progress we've made over the past few years, that really gives me hope. I think, I've seen just massive shifts in organisations and how seriously they're taking climate change and how much action there is. And, even, the work that Cassie and Rosa have been commissioned to do. That's, such important work and it's great to see that, in terms of the climate risk assessment, that it's on the health sector's radar and this work's already beginning. And I think we've got a long way to go, but the last few years and the amount of progress we've achieved, I think that's what gives me hope.
I echo what what the entire panel said in terms of where the progress being something that's really hopeful. There's a wonderful book by Joel Gergis, who's one of the lead authors on the IPCC report, Humanity's Moment, very heavy in the beginning, but I promise it's quite hopeful towards the end. And I think it's obviously the work in advocacy and activism can be quite draining, and I feel that myself a lot, that grief and that mourning, and I give space to that. But something that gives me a lot of hope is reconnecting with environmental stewardship, things like planting forests, as Molly shared yesterday, and learning to rewild, becoming connected with what our native flora and fauna are. That just gives me so much life and vitality, and that's when I'm feeling drained. I think that's what gives me the most hope, is that nature, as we learned, it will return and it will make its way. So that's what gives me hope.
Please join me in thanking this amazing panel.
Thanks, Victoria, and thank you very much to our panellists in Christchurch and here in the room. It's been a really interesting morning, terrific session. The hope factor is something that we need to keep alive, but hope in itself is not a plan. We do need to have a plan, and we do need a strategy, and we do need to stick to it. I think there was a lot of really pearls of wisdom that came out of that last discussion, some really fabulous things about how we support each other, how we collaborate with each other to move the dial on this thing, and I think there's something about calling things out. One of the great things I like about Greta Thunberg is how she calls things out. She calls them for how she sees them. She's not, sort of overwhelmed by the baubles of office. She just calls it, And I think we need to do a lot more of that, actually, to tell you the truth. I think we need to call things out. India and Summer both spoke yesterday, about opportunities for us to act individually and to act collectively, and I think we need to do it. We need to join together. We need to join the groups that are like-minded like ourselves and get involved. No question about that. And we've just heard about a great book that we can go to, and there's lots of different groups, local and international groups, that we can get some succour off. And there's a group that I came across recently called the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, which is quite an interesting group. That's an international collaboration. Wellbeing Economy Alliance. Look them up. There is a branch here in New Zealand. Actually, there was an Australian woman from Vicktoria who's been living in Scotland for quite a few years, who is part of that group. Catelyn, who was recently in Auckland, spoke to that. And actually, for them, there were two things that are actually the most important in our world, and that is, our land and our people. And how do we actually work? And what they do is work with smaller groups. Actually, sometimes, parts of populations, communities, but also whole cities, to try and see with the willing to try and divert the kinds of, regulation, legislation, all those kinds of things towards supporting people and planet, And they've got some great examples on their websites, and there is a group here in New Zealand, that you can look up and perhaps take an interest in. So I think there is actually there's nothing like a good fight. And a fight is what we've got, it's a big fight, so we've got to do it. I think are there any accountants in the room or economists? Because, we're sort of locked into this thing about the business case, and the business case for things. The business case is really good at measuring money, especially short-term costs, and sometimes short-term opportunity, but it's usually about costs, not about opportunity. We're not particularly good about measuring the externalities that we hive off onto other people. So when we think about the idea of value, a value is an outcomes-related thing. It's actually defined as outcomes over costs. You could flip it to become outcomes over opportunity as well, or investment. And actually, in New Zealand, value has been reduced to value for money, which has subsequently been reduced to let's get as much as we can for as little as possible, at enormous costs. And there are examples of that. The selling of the car parking at Middlemore Hospital a number of years ago, 15 years ago, to a private company that has taken millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars out of the poorest community in the country. The building of the buildings at Middlemore Hospital, which were signed off 15 years ago, that after about 10 years were rotting and full of black mold, and the same equivalent amount of money is going in to refurbish them. And so these are the kinds of things that are kind of a bit nuts, and they're driven by the narrow view of value. So I think there's a challenge for the accountants and the economists to start, designing their business cases and then trying their best to include those external costs. And it's, when I think about it, we're so unsophisticated when it comes to those sorts of things. So it's a conversation over lunch, but enjoy your lunch, and we'll be back at 1:30.